Morning. What a wonderful group I see here this morning. I'm Margaret Lowe. I'm president of Atlantic Live, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's forum, Examining Modern Medicine. And I must say, we were very, very happy to get out of steamy Washington, D.C. to come to your beautiful city. So thank you for this weather and all of you for being here. We've actually crisscrossed the country this year, spotlighting some of the most consequential issues in the world of medicine. In Boston, we explored precision medicine and medical breakthroughs. We did a deep dive on genomics in New York City. And now we're turning our attention to the innovation pipeline here in San Francisco, the birthplace of biotech, and needless to say, a hub of innovation. And we've gathered an extraordinary group of people here today, both those who will be on stage and also in the audience, it's worth noting, for today's conversations, from physicians and scientists to biotech leaders and venture capitalists, to talk about where the life sciences industry is headed and about a variety of California moonshots. Is this mic okay? Everybody hearing me okay? All right, I hear it going in and out a little bit. Before we get rolling, I do want to thank America's biopharmaceutical companies, an initiative, our underwriter, Pharma, for making this series possible. Thank you to Pharma. And a few practical notes before we get started. Please silence your cell phone, but don't put them away because we would love you to join the conversation on Twitter. We're at Atlantic Live, that's all one word, and you can use the hashtag Atlantic Medicine. And we'll also want you to be part of the conversation in the room too, so we'll be taking your questions throughout the morning. So let's get rolling with a look at the innovation landscape. Northern California, as all of you here surely know, is often referred to as the innovation capital of the world. And it's my pleasure to kick us off with some of the people who helped make that so. Regis Kelly is a neuroscientist, and it's worth noting that he has been appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire by the Queen of England for his contribution to life sciences. That's the first time I've ever had the pleasure of saying that. Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning.
Beyond that, he is Executive Director of QB3, the University of California's Hub for Innovation and Entrepreneurship in the Life Sciences. Sarah Radcliffe is President and CEO of California Life Sciences Association, whose mission is to grow the state's biotech footprint. Welcome. And Barry Selleck, Vice Chancellor of Business Development, Innovation, and Partnerships at UCSF. Barry oversees proof of concept studies of promising UCSF life sciences inventions. And here to lead the conversation is my colleague, Alexis Madrigal, who writes about all things technology for The Atlantic. Alexis, good morning and take it away.
Thanks, Margaret. Hello, everyone. How many people here remember when none of these buildings over here were in San Francisco? That is wild. This is like a really interesting view of the development of the city with the Salesforce Tower over there. Obviously, there's been a ton of money flowing through San Francisco, and I think sometimes people forget that this is the home of biotech, one of the leading hubs in the country, and I'm so glad that we can all be here together to talk about that ecosystem. We're going to talk about geography in just a second, but I also want to give people a chance just to kind of hear a little bit from each of you. Reg, can you just describe for the audience, for anyone who doesn't know, what QB3 does?
Okay, so I'm a professor still at UCSF, and my job is to try and capture the innovations that come through the University of UCSF, but also the other campuses of the University of California, and try to translate them as efficiently as possible into the private sector so that they can improve human health.
Sarah, could you describe the role in the biotech ecosystem here in the state for California Life Sciences Association?
Sure. So California Life Sciences Association is the statewide trade association for the life sciences in California, and we offer services in two broad areas. One is advocacy, so we have an office in Washington, D.C., and also in Sacramento, and we lobby for a business, regulatory, legislative climate that supports innovation in the life sciences. And we also provide business development assistance to life sciences companies and entrepreneurs, so networking, advising, partnering, and educational seminars.
Cool. And Barry, tell me a little bit more about being the head of business development at a university. Is this something that many universities have at this point? And is it primarily focused in life sciences?
Well, UCSF is a life science focused campus, doesn't have an undergraduate school. It doesn't have engineering and other disciplines like that. So yeah, it's exclusively focused on life sciences, therapeutics, as well as medical devices, as well as digital health technologies. Most universities have people involved in business development, if you will. That is protecting intellectual property, protecting inventions by faculty members, and then either licensing those to other companies or using them as the basis of startup companies. I think what differentiates UCSF from others is that the university has made a huge commitment in terms of creating a new activity, a new role within the university that I occupy that not only oversees business development, but also innovation and the fostering of ideas to proof of concept. So our
Does that mean
goal...
you're raising money to do that support?
Exactly right. So that's a little different from what's been done in the past. There's a so-called valley of death that most people are familiar with, the university inventors face, where the university inventor has sufficient funds frequently to identify an interesting target or maybe a hit molecule, but they don't have the funds to mature that to a clinical lead or let alone get it into the clinic. And that's the so-called valley of death. So we're raising a fund by which we can invest in those most promising projects to shepherd them through the valley of death and get them to a point where that we have some sort of proof of concept which can form the basis of either a new company or much more lucrative license agreement with an acquiring company.
So let's talk a little bit about the development of San Francisco as a biotech hub. I mean, I've been all over the country. I don't know how many of you have done this, and you see all these cities and regions trying to develop into hubs of various kinds, right? They want to become a tech hub, a biotech hub, an agri-sciences hub, whatever it is. And no one seems to be able to duplicate what's going on here. There's been obviously a lot of historical research on the tech side as well as the biotech side into why it is that this place came into being. But from your perspectives and looking back on your careers, what would you say? What's made San Francisco one of the two preeminent biotech hubs, if not number one?
Well, first of all, thank you for saying that we are in fact the top hub, because I hear say that there
I'm
are
a
some
homer.
people.
I live in
Some people think that Massachusetts is a rival. Here in the Bay Area, we do think that we have really achieved that first-ranked spot in the world for a number of reasons. First of all, birthplace of biotech, January 1976, when Swanson went down to see Boyer and had what is now, I think, sort of considered the iconic beginning of biotech conversation, which led to the founding of Genentech. So that was the genius of a few people coming together and really envisioning something new happening in this area. But of course, the area itself was ripe to exploit that kind of innovative thinking because of the confluence of the stellar academic institutions. You had established companies, and you also had what I think is very hard to define, but critical in any innovation hub, and that is the entrepreneurial spirit. So really the willingness to take big risks on processes that are long, complicated, and expensive. You have to have a body of people willing to do that with venture capital, willing to fund them in order to make a hub like this as extraordinary as it is.
It's amazing. You can go back and read like Mark Twain on the sort of like spirit of San Francisco, and every time I read it, I'm just like, what is this nonsense? Come on, we're not being influenced by the people who came here in 1848. And then you look at it and you think, wait, biotech hub, 3 of the 6 largest companies in the world. It's an amazing thing.
I think it's the juxtaposition of venture capital to innovation. And, you know, obviously it helps to have bright, innovative people coming out of UCSF, Stanford, UC Santa Cruz, and the like. But venture capitalists, by and large, don't like to get on planes. They like to be able to get in the car and drive 30, 45 minutes for a board meeting. And I don't know if Reg did this by design or it's more convergent evolution, but when he and Doug Crawford set up QB3 at UCSF, he ended up integrating all of those components into his QB3 model. Great inventor innovation with venture capital, as well as a place for inventors to incubate their ideas.
Yes. To put one other idea onto this, it's been well known for a long time that many of the companies, the IT companies in the Bay Area, are started by Chinese or Indian people. That's been well established. We actually looked through about the 400 companies we've helped get started in the life sciences space and asked how many of them were led by immigrants. It turned out it was 52%. So that number is true both in the life sciences and the IT space. And I think one of the big advantages we have in this place, having a very cosmopolitan culture, it turns out, immigrants tend to be very likely to become innovators. And so, for example, when I talk to colleagues from China who are trying to do this in China, I said, you've had it. You're not going to get immigrants in China the same ways we get them into the Bay Area.
That's interesting. Let's talk about Boston versus San Francisco. This seems to be, give me the best case for Boston, Sarah. What's your,
no.
Give me the, what would they say?
I'm president and CEO of the California Life Sciences
Oh, I know.
Association.
Best case for Boston.
Well, so we see many lists because when you think about life sciences sort of robustness, you can talk about number of companies, you can talk about number of patents filed, number of deals done, and so I see lists where Massachusetts does come out ahead on certain things. I would call out one thing though that I think everybody in the Bay Area envies, and that is the sort of concentration of great companies, great private research institutions, philanthropic organizations, et cetera, around Kendall Square. So one thing we love the fact that the Bay Area has wonderful companies dotted around, but it can be hard to get around the Bay Area. And so the one thing I would say for Massachusetts, and it's really the only thing I'm going to say for Massachusetts, I have to ask someone else, is just that intensity in that space, I think, is really wonderful. And anybody who's been to Kendall Square and had coffee and seen people wander through, and just chit-chat with one another, that is a wonderful thing.
It's like Stacks in Burlingame. Go to Stacks in Burlingame on any weekday
See,
morning.
I mean, even that, we're
There'll be
better.
half a dozen venture capitalists in there trying to do a deal.
Yeah.
Reg, what about you?
Yeah, well, I think, since currently, more NIH money goes into the Boston area than comes in here. So for driving life sciences, they have the advantage. A larger fraction of their money is coming from NIH. So we're getting more money into the Bay Area, but a large part of it is coming into the IT space as well as the, so just the fraction of our income that's coming from NIH is smaller here.
It's interesting. I mean, the more interesting battle seems to be between Boston and San Francisco as these sort of clusters versus everybody else. I was looking at some interesting numbers in Forbes, which showed those two hubs kind of distancing themselves from the next tier of life sciences hubs. If you were to think about what those other places could do to sort of keep pace, what would it be? Like if you're Research Triangle in North Carolina.
Yeah. Well, a supportive legislative environment is extremely important. Here in California, while the Bay Area was kind of the beginning, we do have extraordinary hubs across the state, and they can really help one another in terms of thinking about how do you build a life sciences hub at the local level, when you think about traffic and zoning, at the state level, think about taxes and job creation and funding for science, and then at the federal level, you've got FDA and you've got CMS, and so that whole body of legislative and regulatory requirements and incentives is incredibly important. In California, I think we're almost becoming the victims of our success. We really, really need to work very closely with and this is part of our mission, with our representatives to make sure we're maintaining that edge. And what we see is that, North Carolina and Texas and Kentucky and Arizona, and the states are really waking up to the fact that jobs in the life sciences sector are great jobs, they're well-paying, they're clean jobs, they foster indirect jobs, and they are coming up with incentives. So
Let me ask you, I feel like when I was coming up, I was first writing about these topics, 10 years ago, it felt like San Diego was still, kind of, if not number one, and kind of like 1A. What's been happening in San Diego, and what would you say about that hub? Or anybody else, Reg?
Yeah, I think it's excellent. I really love UCSD in particular. I think it's, again, as Barry was saying earlier, the lack of venture capital. So when we run contests, as I do for all of the University of California, in the life sciences areas, the San Diego companies really are eager to come and pitch up here because this is where most of the angel and venture investment is. And I think, as Barry said earlier, that actually is pretty well key. And San Diego doesn't have that.
That's
Yes.
absolute. Oh, sorry.
So I just
Go ahead.
wanted to share kind of a hypothesis in thinking about this. Maybe it's overreaching, and you can correct me if I am. But when I think back on Cambridge, when did Cambridge and Kendall Square begin to transform and flourish and become a hub? It was kind of simultaneous with Mark Levin selling Millennium to Takeda and then forming Third Rock Ventures. Third Rock really kind of turned the venture model at that point in time on its head. It was making huge Series A bets. It was not uncommon for Third Rock to invest $40 to $50 million by themselves in a Series A company. That was simultaneous, in my view, with kind of the ascension of Cambridge as a hub. In San Diego, conversely, you've always had groups, Forward Ventures, Domain, Avalon, a couple of others that I can't name right off the top of my head. But to me, the turning point is an unfortunate one. Jeff Solander, who was a very charismatic, outgoing guy at Forward Ventures, he was a real spark, and he was involved in starting a lot of creative companies. He was unfortunately killed in a car accident when he was driving his Ferrari at an unsafe speed. And if you look back in time, it's almost as if that event was simultaneous with San Diego losing some momentum in the biotech space.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there's obviously a lot of historical debate about these kinds of contingencies, right? Could one person actually have made that much of a difference?
Perhaps at the beginning, it's really true. What Reg said did bring to mind one other thing about creating a life sciences hub, which is I think it can be very successful to pick something and really go with it. And so something that San Diego has really built up is a kind of a nexus of companies around genomics. So for a hub that is up and coming, or really in the case of San Diego, pretty well established, what you can do is to identify specific areas and really lead the pack in those areas.
So in this area too, right, everybody is talking about artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, and a lot of these things are being applied sort of liberally across different domains. Do you think that changes the sort of regional picture, San Francisco versus Boston, because of the amount of AI and machine learning development that's happening here?
Well, there are some really good things. There are some partnerships going on between UCSF and Google, which I'm not allowed to talk about, but they are...
Feel free, though, if you need to.
Yeah, but one of the things that works well when you've got massive amounts of data, right? That's when machine learning becomes very useful, and so that's what they're using it for. But when it comes to sort of many of the things that we're involved with, it's sort of artificial. I'm not so convinced artificial intelligence has a whole lot to contribute. Like when you, what are our problems right now? Our problems are, for using the best of our molecular biology, but only 1 in every maybe 10 of the things that get up through IND ever get into clinical trials, using the best of our molecular biology. And why is that? It's because our molecular biology sucks on this thing. It's not good enough yet. And the whole drug development thing is still basically an empirical thing. And the trouble is that you need to have, we're detecting each individual molecule as a target, and it's a system that works here. So what one needs to do is to think of biological things as a system and develop a way of taking our data, converting it into a circuit diagram of the cell. And artificial intelligence at this present format isn't doing that, to my knowledge. And so it isn't really addressing what, for me, is the major problem in the pharmaceutical industry, and we just haven't turned it out to being an empirical science. You might think that's a little hard, Barry, as a...
No, I think it's a good point, Reg. I think we work with a number of companies in addition to Google, and some of those programs are focused on really trying to create predictive computational models for different aspects of the drug discovery development paradigm. And the problem is, you're right, it's not just that molecular biology sucks. We don't have an adequate understanding of some of the basic fundamental, like quantum chemical aspects of drug metabolism. Most metabolizing enzymes, your cytochrome P450s, the major one, 3A4, it metabolizes 40 to 45% of all xenobiotics it comes in contact with. It's an enzyme, and yet how can it be so promiscuous? It's because it doesn't interact with substrates in a typical enzyme substrate fashion. It's more akin to solution chemistry. We don't really have an adequate way of modeling that. So we'd love to. We'd love to be able to model that and build in predictive algorithms that would allow you to look at a virtual structure of a drug candidate and predict how quickly it will be metabolized and by which enzymes. We don't have the science yet with which to do that. So there's a technical gap that needs to be overcome.
There's another area that I'd love to see people getting involved with. Every drug is designed, goes through very careful clinical trials, pharmacokinetics, and so on. But then it gets out into patients, and most patients are taking 5 or 10 different drugs, and that combination of drugs has never been tested, right? So this is now we're thinking of patients out there as being the test thing. Can we use artificial intelligence to look at inadvertent drug interactions by looking at massive databases? That's a very good way of trying to use artificial intelligence.
How else do you think the IT industry, that version of tech, should be interacting with the biotech world? Obviously, you have a series of things coming out of Google and Amazon. Well, Amazon recently, Chrissy Farr, she's here with 1492, and all of these traditional tech companies seem like they're extending a pseudopod towards the life sciences. How would you like to see them come into this world?
I think these two are right, that we have yet to really see how AI is going to help drug development. On the delivery side, on the clinical side, I think there's immense potential for improving healthcare delivery, and as I think Reg was getting at in his last remark, really thinking about how to optimize and perfect patients' interactions when it comes to, understand drug interactions better and make their experience of treatment much more efficient. So I think that's probably where it ends up. And you think about companies like Verily, and we're going to hear from Rob Califf later, Google, Facebook. That's where they have immense amounts of data that could really be transformational.
Yeah, let me just add one refinement. And it's important to distinguish between applying AI and machine learning to the drug discovery clinical development process, what Reg and I were alluding to earlier. It's quite a different situation when you're talking about digital health and clinical data. Okay, and so there is a big push. Bob Wachter, who's the chairman of the Department of Medicine, is known within the community as the quote-unquote digital doctor. He's written extensively on digital health technologies. Mike Blum, as well as Atul Butte, who are both on the faculty at UCSF, are also highly focused in digital health with a real emphasis on how to apply machine learning to improve clinical outcomes of patients, either in clinical trials or who are just living their life taking 5, 6, 7 different medications.
But unfortunately, a lot of the precision medicine thing is aimed at improved diagnosis, and I think we're certainly going to the direction we're going to be able to tell long in advance of showing symptoms. We'll know whether you're going to get sick. The trouble is, if you know you're going to get sick and there's nothing you can do about it, it's not very advantageous. So for example, knowing I was going to get Alzheimer's in 5 years doesn't do me any good because there's nothing I can do about it, right? So this is where I think that we're getting lots of IT coming into diagnostics, but where we really, really need the help is in trying to develop the therapeutics.
We touched a little bit on regulation and the state, but what about the federal level? Has the new administration changed anything for you all?
Has the new administration done anything?
So we do have a new commissioner, Dr. Gottlieb, and he has long experience on a number of fronts at the FDA, at CMS, very politically astute, has been in the investment world. So he's bringing a lot of different kinds of experience. And I think his track record, even in the short time he's been at the agency, has been very helpful. Trying to identify specific initiatives. So for example, speeding the approval of generic drugs, implementing the 21st Century Cures Act, making sure that the hiring that was authorized is happening. So all of those things, I think, are very positive.
Do any of you hope or expect that there'll be a major reform to the FDA in the next 10 years, say?
I don't expect a major reform. I mean, recall that the major remit of the FDA is to safeguard patients. So their primary focus is on patient safety. And there's a minimum amount of work that you have to do in order to demonstrate that a drug is safe. Now, if it's efficacious, that's icing on the cake, I think, as far as the FDA is concerned. But I would have a hard time envisioning major reforms at the agency.
You know, I've heard people say it's not actually, excuse me, the FDA that's the problem. It's really the reimbursement strategy. That's actually more of a challenge to startup companies, to knowing what the government policy will be, because essentially the government sets the price of any development, of any drug, and trying to get a more intelligent reimbursement or a more predictable reimbursement policy would probably be more advantageous than any alterations in the FDA.
That's great. We have some time for questions. We have about 5 minutes. We've got mic runners. Let's go right here.
Sir, yes, can you introduce yourself? I'll hold the microphone.
Hi, my name is Dan Lappin, and I'm an innovation creativity consultant to the industry. So my question, Regis, is for you. You've mentioned creating circuitry, taking data and making a map, and then you talked about IT. It's not about diagnostic, about how we do therapy. Okay? So the bigger question is, as we sit here in the life cycle of biology, is there this shift between our concepts of cognition and neuroscience versus systems biology, where there's the bigger map and it's a connection, and that's the real value there? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm a Scotsman, very much more pragmatic, right? I think the challenge right now is not to come up with any particularly fancy algorithm, but to actually address what really takes place in the biological systems. It's not a gene product that does anything, right? It's a protein machine that's assembled from 10 or 20 different gene products. And what we've not done nearly as well currently is understand how many protein machines there are in a cell and how they function. So a way that I think, which is going to be a big improvement in technology in the next 10 years, is in focus more on proteomics, how the peptides and the gene products assemble into a machine and how they will work. When we can do that, then we'll be able to make the sort of breakthroughs conceptually that we need to do drug design. I think we have to move away from the focus on genes right now and focus on protein machines.
There's another question right there.
Sorry.
Here we go. We'll go right here next.
Me first?
You first.
Okay, my name is Sri Kamandan. I work at a company called Crescendo Bioscience. It's a lab diagnostic company. And I thought your question about reimbursement was interesting because I'm an ops manager there, so we see this every day, the challenges with reimbursement that you see when you actually try to make a kind of actual healthcare product and try to make basically make money off it, right? And have success. So have you heard of any innovative or interesting solutions for the government or private sector around reimbursement strategy and how we could solve this challenge of payer reimbursement as we are still in a private insurance market?
I wish I could say yes, but I haven't heard any good thinking coming up. Perhaps someone in the audience, or Barry, have you heard of?
I've heard nothing in that regard.
I think the overriding characteristic right now is uncertainty. Clearly, the situation with the future of the Affordable Care Act is really what has been governing debate ever since the election. That landscape is becoming clearer. I think that, go ahead and make a prediction. I don't think there will be a root and branch repeal of the ACA. I never thought that was possible. I don't see how it's possible now. But there's a lot of tweaks, some great and some not so great, and I think the discussion moves to some really important questions about the extent of Medicaid funding. Will Medicaid funding be block granted? Will eligibility for Medicare be expanded or diminished? In terms of the role of the private insurers, obviously the private insurers have suffered from their profits have not suffered, but their business planning honestly has suffered from the fact that there's just no predictability right now with regard to cost-sharing subsidies and the risk payments and so forth. And so I took the easy way out and answered your question by focusing on regulatory, because honestly it is very hard right now to answer your question until we have a more stable framework within which we can all work. Then I think we can start profitably thinking about, okay, what's the answer?
Let's go quickly here. We got to go quick, so we have about 30 seconds.
Oh. My name is Shelley Gordon, and my company is G2 Communications. We're a healthcare marketing company. And I wanted to address something you said about algorithms as they apply to clinical trials. And then you said if we we can predict that I'll have Alzheimer's in 5 years. What good is it? Because there's nothing to treat it. But what about early detection for cancers? I'd love to hear your perspective on that. Lung cancer, you don't find out about it until it's stage 4. Ovarian cancer, you don't find out about it until it's stage 4. How can algorithms help with early diagnostics?
Yes. That's your area, Barry.
Yeah, well, I think with respect to oncology, early detection is obviously optimal, but where the folks at UCSF who are developing these technologies are moving is towards predicting more acute situations, cardiac events, for example. There's a program underway called the Healthy Heart Trial, in which thousands of volunteers are wearing Fitbits and monitoring heartbeat and pulse rates, and the ultimate goal is to try to correlate kind of lifestyle as measured with a Fitbit with incidents of heart events, and then ultimately develop a predictive tool that will tell someone, listen, you keep this up, you're at increased risk for heart attack.
Thank you so much, panelists, and we'll be off the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reg, Sarah, and Barry, and thank you, Alexis. Our next session is produced by our underwriter, Pharma, and it is called Putting the Bio in Biotech, the Challenges and Future of Biopharmaceuticals. I think the title says it all, so please welcome Nils Longberg. He is Senior Vice President of Oncology Discovery Biology at Bristol Myers Squibb. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Ron Ludy, biotech reporter for the San Francisco Business Times, is here to lead the conversation. Ron, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we've got 10 minutes, so we're going to dive right in. Ipilimumab, also known as Yervoy, had a not easy journey, but now is very successful, one of the early cancer immunotherapy drugs. Talk a little bit about the key to winning FDA approval and maybe the support of an organization to getting a drug through that long process?
Well, the key to getting FDA approval, that was actually not that difficult once we presented the right data. So the phase 3 trial that we took to the FDA for approval was an overall survival trial, and it was in fact the first drug that ever showed a survival benefit in metastatic melanoma. And that was, I think, fairly straightforward. But the path to get to that particular point, it's an understatement to say that it was not linear. I think any new technology, any drug, typically does not have a linear trajectory. There are ups and downs, and you have to have a supportive board if you're a biotech company, or a supportive senior management if you're a pharma company, to look beyond some of the dips and be willing to take risks and move forward with something that is potentially a breakthrough. It's potentially very promising. And looking back, if ipilimumab had not been successful, I don't think any of the PD-1 drugs would have appeared. Merck didn't take their PD-1 drug into the clinic until after our phase 3 trial for ipilimumab. And I don't think that the Bristol-Myers board would have supported the investment that we've now made in Opdivo if it wasn't for the success of ipilimumab. So it's a good thing that there were supportive people who are willing to take risks, who are willing to look beyond the low points and push, a new potentially breakthrough technology forward.
And this all started with a small company, Medarex, and you had the partnership with BMS, and then the acquisition by BMS. But I'd like to, during those years, way back when, people were telling me, especially during the Great Recession, oh, we don't want the Bay Area to become the next Seattle. Apologies to anyone from Seattle. But where a larger company would come in, acquire the assets, move them to the East Coast or wherever. So this was around the time of Onyx as well. A lot of that talent shifts, but how does the Bay Area maintain the presence it has in the biotech industry when companies do see attractive companies here and buy them? How do they keep it here?
Well, there's a lot of things to unwrap there. First of all, Bristol-Myers recognized the value in the Bay Area, and that's why they kept us in the Bay Area and let us, in fact, grow in the Bay Area. We've got a fairly large drug discovery site now. It's the largest drug discovery site for oncology for Bristol-Myers Squibb. But how does a biotech community react to these acquisitions? Sometimes they thrive. I mean, I think the example of 1986, I think it was, that Eli Lilly acquired Hypertech in San Diego, and arguably that event sparked the proliferation of biotech companies in San Diego. People left Hypertech and they went on to found other companies, and the investment that went into Hypertech, the local investment, then got recouped from the acquisition by Lilly, and that encouraged more investment. So within a particular local environment, it depends on investors, it depends on talent, it depends on all of these things. It's a very complex landscape, and it's an ecosystem where every single piece of it needs to get fed.
Mm-hmm. And talking of those pieces, one of the key pieces here is the academic infrastructure. I know BMS is involved with the UCSF immunoprofiler. I don't know if everyone's familiar with that, but I wrote about that back in January, but maybe you can talk a little bit about that program and what BMS is doing in this very sharing kind of program.
Yeah, I think that's a model for a kind of a partnership between an academic medical center and pharmaceutical companies. There are things that you can only do within an academic medical centers where you're close to the patients, you're close to patient samples, and a number of pharmaceutical companies, not just Bristol Myers Squibb, invested in this. It's an information sharing program. We're not keeping any of the information to ourselves. The academic groups are going to publish all of the work. It's, I think, a perfect partnership that is required in a new field like immunotherapy, where we don't have very many answers yet. We're just beginning to sort of uncover the basic science, and so we all need to sort of pool our resources and talent to understand this new landscape.
And maybe if you can expand on that a little bit more. This program is looking more at how the immune system responds to drugs and other therapy than just, a certain type of cancer. If you can dive a little deeper on that.
Well, you mentioned a certain type of cancer. The PD-1 pathway targeted drugs are very interesting because it's the first time, probably since combination chemotherapy, that a modality of therapy has worked so well across a variety of different types of cancer, different histologies, we call it. And we're learning that a lot of different cancers, that arise from different tissue types actually have more in common with each other than they do with cancers that previously would have been viewed as being related. So one patient's kidney cancer might actually have a lot more in common with another patient's lung cancer than two different lung cancer patients' cancers. And that's what we're trying to uncover. We're trying to learn from this scientific endeavor how to better classify cancers so that we can better pick the right therapies for the right patients.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So some of your partners there, AbbVie, Amgen, anybody else?
I'm sure that we're missing a bunch.
But there are other companies here who are trying to do what BMS has done: acquire, consolidate, grow. Merck being one of them, with their new headquarters going up, West Coast Research Headquarters in South San Francisco. You're in Redwood City. What has this ecosystem, how has this ecosystem benefited what BMS is trying to do in immunotherapy?
Well, the partnership with UCSF and various collaborations that we have with Stanford, UCSF, Berkeley over the years, that's one example. Probably the most important is just the ability to recruit talented scientists. We are getting fantastic young scientists from these academic institutions around the Bay Area, and that's what's key to a good research organization, is good people.
And rather than recruiting them from elsewhere, I mean, people come to the Bay Area and they go, a $17 piece of toast, really? So having that talent already here, Stanford, Berkeley, UCSF.
That's key. That's absolutely key. But I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the larger ecosystem. So when we started up the first biotech company that I was involved in 1989, one of our investors was Kleiner Perkins. Kleiner Perkins wanted us to be local so that they could, keep an eye on us. And so we set up shop here in the Bay Area. That company was then bought by Medarex, an East Coast company, which was then bought by Bristol Myers Squibb. But it's that access to investor capital, access to talent, access to healthcare institutions, all of that together makes up the landscape, I think.
Great. Well, we have 10 seconds left. I just want to take the time to thank you and thank the Atlantic for hosting the event.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you, Niels. Biotech and the broader life sciences business are part of a multi-billion-dollar industry, often high risk and high reward. Next up, we're going to explore what issues the venture capitalists who bet on this sector are grappling with these days, and we've gathered some top VCs to get their take on the landscape. So please welcome Leon Chen, a venture partner at OrbiMed, which invests across the healthcare industry in everything from seed stage to large publicly traded companies. Welcome. Carol Gallagher is a partner at New Enterprise Associates. She's an investor who spent years in the executive ranks of both the pharmaceutical and biotech industries. And Andrew Schiff is a physician by training and a managing partner of Aceling Capital, which invests in healthcare products, technologies, and life science companies. And they are here with my colleague, Washington editor-at-large, Steve Clemens.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. So you guys all just met like half an hour ago, but you've all been doing business with each other's companies. And I want to know, since this is about the business side of the innovation side of the pharmaceutical and biotech industry, how many deals have you guys done with each other in the last 30 or 45 minutes?
We can't tell you.
They were actually talking about something where they had been co-investors in something, and I don't want to go into like gossip, but Genentech killed a drug or something. No, maybe that's not true. But let me just open up a conversation here just on the subject of when you think about the innovation pipeline and how to think about good investments, how you look at that continuum. Carol, you and I were talking about this. I'm really interested. I want to just have an uncomfortable conversation for a minute. When you look at a new opportunity in a sector, are you looking at the profits to be made in a disease, or are you looking at the human value, the social value of actually moving the needle on something society needs? Leon?
I think it's both, right? I think especially in this day and age, in order to have a successful commercial drug, it actually has to have a pretty significant impact on that patient population. So, there were periods of times when discovering and developing drugs that have marginal benefits could actually have a commercial space in the world. I think that is changing. I think we really do have to, shoot the moon a little bit every time that we're investing in a new therapeutic.
Drew?
I think I would agree with both. I would just add that one of the great themes I think we're party to collectively is this evolution of life sciences, which was named sort of the life science sector originally, insofar as we funded science projects, has evolved to a point where the majority of companies in the life sciences sector have become or will be drug development companies. Mm-hmm. And this is to say that newly approved drugs have such a substantial impact on medical care. When you think about when I was in medical school, multiple myeloma was a death sentence. Mm. It's now, I won't say it's a chronic disease, but it's now the life expectancy has increased so tremendously over the years. I mean, relatively recently, the new drug Imbruvica and its treatment for lymphoma has, altered the course of therapy for that disease.
So would you say that is so I would say that's a good news story.
Yep.
Of where all of the players, the stakeholders in the process, including, I assume, the FDA, which we were talking about,
yep,
played their role right. How many stories are not good news stories and where things don't go right in that continuum?
Well, I think that the media often picks up on a lot of those stories. I would say that it's been interesting to me to watch how Valiant or Theranos or Martin Shkreli...
Just want you to notice he mentioned Theranos first.
will dominate the headlines for an extended period of time. So I think that to the extent stories don't go right, they're covered and they're out there.
Carol, you and I were actually discussing the financial pathway. We were also discussing Theranos and why none of you were investors in that company. Can you take us down what you think is the healthy continuum for entrepreneurs, innovators, investors looking in this sector, what you think some of the pitfalls are?
Well, I agree with what was said about, what I think is tremendous about being in the biopharma industry, and I've been there almost 30 years now, is that unmet medical need and solving a problem for patients lines up with economic return. So if you do something great, like cure HCV, you should get rewarded. And that's what we're investing in. We're investing in true innovation that changes human health. Now, the challenge is it's very capital intensive, and it takes a long time. And those things are not sometimes easy for people to understand because we're in a society that wants it done tomorrow. And we want to believe, oh, surely there's a shortcut. But in drug development, there aren't shortcuts. You can be clever, you can be strategic, you can encourage a dialogue with the FDA to try to find a very efficient path, but you can't cut corners. And I think
So a single drop of blood is not enough.
Well, apparently not in that case, but you have to be data-driven. And so what I like about being an investor is I started as a data-driven person, and that's what really investing in biopharma is all about, is looking at the data, getting a great team that has a lot of experience about how to do drug development, and then giving them the capital and the opportunity to keep passing those milestones, but also being really self-disciplined when it's a no-go. The first company I was the CEO of was a company in Atlanta. I came in at the beginning of the Series B investment. They had done original chemistry out of Emory around a target called CXCR4 for cancer. They had set up a screen in the academic setting. It had then come into a company, and there was an original CEO who was a chemist who got it to IND stage, meaning it's ready to go into humans. And that's when I came into the picture. We were starting clinical trials in cancer patients with this drug. I started doing work to really look into what's our data set, how much have we really proven outside of the academic center that this hits the target it hits. I could not prove that it hit that target. I don't know what that compound is, but it doesn't hit CXCR4. Meanwhile, we're asking cancer patients to enter a trial. We have to stop that trial, of course, and we did as soon as possible. Within 6 months, sadly, but the right decision, we shut down the company and returned the remaining capital. Now, that wasn't exactly what I thought my first CEO gig was going to be.
But you survived it.
And it was the right thing to do because it is capital intensive, and every dollar that's going towards something like that isn't going to make it is a dollar that doesn't go towards something that's really important to be a breakthrough, like Drew was talking about in terms of myeloma, but also melanoma. There's so many places, lymphoma. We've made such progress in the last 10 years in cancer. It's really inspiring. So I think that's the really key thing is to recognize we've got to make really good decisions about where that capital goes.
Leon, I'm going to hold you for one more question because I don't want to go to you yet. But I want to ask the two of you because I know you've been an investor for a long time in this field we were talking about. You were just talking about your firm is actually going to celebrate its 40th anniversary. And you said something profound and disturbing a minute ago, Carol, where you said there are no shortcuts, it's not a slow process. But I think that what we've seen in things from our iPhone that's a decade old, others to the app, to the facility that we have with data today, the mass amounts of data, kind of looking at the universe and the way gravity has changed, I guess my question to you is, why isn't it faster? Why are you satisfied with that question that there ought to be shortcuts? In my mind is telling me there ought to be ways to sort of move the game faster for humanity, if you will, given all of the technological advances we have. So talk, as Rachel Maddow would say, talk me down. Where am I wrong? And 40 years ago, I assume your firm was thinking about a certain way. 20 years ago, it was operating a certain way. 5 years, it was probably operating differently. So what have you learned in that trajectory about the changing ecosystem for both of you?
Well, so our firm invests in both tech and life sciences, and I think the founders, the reason they had the vision to do both is because they did believe it was going to be cyclical, and that the capital intensity in tech would be less, and it would happen faster, and the capital intensity in life sciences would be more, and it would happen slower. And if you invested across those two areas, you could then play out those peaks and troughs. And I think that's been the success of the firm. Now, the reason is that, and this is always hard for people who are technical, engineers, well, why isn't it simple? But people who are in medicine and biology recognize that biology is immensely complex. And unfortunately, we don't have very good models in animals to predict what happens in humans. We cure lots of mice, not so many humans. And that is the challenge about why it takes so long.
Drew?
Yeah, I often think that the only thing that biotech and tech share in common is the word tech.
Touche.
Drug development is a highly regulated industry. It's regulated when you think about it as a thought experiment. I mean, maybe Snapchat is harmful to the American public. I really don't think so. But the administering of new medication that hasn't been properly tested, at least historically, has not been great. And the FDA, when many years ago it didn't allow thalidomide to come into this country, as provided a high degree of safety for pregnant women at the time. That said, our industry has pushed the FDA and collaborated with the FDA largely to create certain paths that have allowed for accelerated approval under sort of unusual circumstances for cancer drugs, for certain drugs, for
HIV.
infectious diseases such as HIV, which was actually the first drug ever approved on a surrogate endpoint, which is a technical term. But so there are expedited pathways. That said, the FDA is there to protect the American public, and I think that's the discussion we continue to have to press forward, try and abbreviate the timelines to some extent, but as Carol said, to make sure that the appropriate studies are done. I think our industry generally has gotten much better at completing these types of packages and their submissions to the FDA, and that's also helped these timelines to some extent.
I'm going to have the Barack Obama's last FDA commissioner on stage in just a little bit. What if he were still incumbent in his job, what would be the thing you would most say the FDA needs to fix?
Well, I think Rob Califf, having been at Duke before and having experience with clinical trials, really understands all of this and is sort of in an excellent position to balance the needs and wants of drug companies and or life science companies with sort of the appropriate regulation, and sort of was party to that because he's run clinical studies. So I would say that, again, the biggest cost to us as investors is, if you think about it, if you have a drug company and you have to wait 8 months for the FDA to respond to your letter, or 6 months, you're still paying all the people at that company for 6 months while you're waiting. So it's the ability of the FDA to quickly turn around the information they receive, determine what's complete, determine what's not complete, and make some sort of accurate assessment about what additional data they need to either approve your drug, suggest other studies, or ultimately, as Carol said, in circumstances that are not warranted, not approve your drug.
Leon, you have a model that I think is a bit different from what I understand, which is you actually invest and you actually help incubate and you actually take over as a CEO of some firms. I know you're driving a firm right now that's looking at the genetic drivers in Alzheimer's, and you're the CEO of that and running that, and you're at OrbiMed also. So I'm interested in that case where you're living this hybrid life, and I know I was reading about the fact that you're going to exit that, you're going to replace yourself with a CEO. Does the staff get depressed, or do they cheer when you leave?
Depends on the day of the week.
But I'm interested in the model of, you're in this area, and so it comes back to the question of why this specific arena, why did it look attractive to you, how's it going, and how is your sort of investor and incubator model comparing to the rest of the industry? Because it sounds like you're not the CEO of one of the firms you're investing in, right?
No. So Carol's firm is diversified in terms of tech and healthcare. OrbiMed is 100% healthcare.
Right.
So we try and pride ourselves in being able to make an impact across the board in any asset type at any level, but all within the boundaries of healthcare. So given that kind of broad mandate, one aspect of what we do is actually to work at very, very early stages to either invest in new startup companies, but in some cases to actually build those companies ourselves. Carol highlighted the issue of management and people who have experience in doing drug discovery and development. That's unquestionably critical to having a successful outcome and maximizing the potential of any technology or any drug. I think similarly speaking, having, the role that I play is literally to make sure things get put together the right way, to identify those right people, matching them up with the right technologies, and creating not just a great technology to put money into, but finding the right people who can shepherd that and take that forward. The model, in terms of having me in, is kind of similar to what a lot of people use as entrepreneurs in residence. The problem with EIRs, at least in the healthcare industry, is because things take so long, you would have an EIR that may be brilliant, and they may start a company, and they end up running the company. You might see him or her again 15 years from now. And so the throughput of that is just not scalable. And so the idea is I'm sort of a rechargeable battery for them. If I can find great CEOs to end up running the companies that we end up incubating, then you can turn that over maybe every 18 to 24 months as opposed to every 7 to 15
How many
years.
have you done that way?
So I've done 2 so far in the 4 years that I've been there. And hopefully they're not asking me to do another one to meet tomorrow, but there's always that kind of expectation that there's something else brewing in the background.
One of the discussions that we often have in the sort of northeast quarter of the country on this is something that I don't hear as much about on the West Coast. I'm interested in why is the the property rights and sort of the periods of owning when you're an innovator. And I understand in the drug industry it's basically 12 years. Is that enough for you guys? Do you want more? Do you want less? How do you feel? I mean, I know that bio tech is a bit different than the pharmaceutical sector, but it's something that sort of permeates all the discussions about the length of essentially monopoly stakeholding in these innovations. Drew?
Well, I think that the novel inventions are deserving of intellectual property, and that there is a strategy around intellectual property to establish through what's called a composition of matter patent, and then potentially extend that past to whatever term there is after a drug is approved. The issue usually raises its head, so to speak, if it takes an incredibly long time to develop the drug. And by the time you're 3/4 of the way through development, the patent itself is almost expired. Then one faces a strategic decision about whether it's worth all of, as Carol pointed out, the enormous amount of invested capital to then get a drug approved that no longer has any patent life whatsoever. So the FDA has weighed in to some extent on this as well, creating some.
Does that mean you've got a generic competitor at birth?
You in theory could initially. There are a variety of ways to increase or give new patent life for a number of years in a more abbreviated fashion, but I think that is the give and take around patent lives. And people forget, in a way, that in the United States and also around the globe, I mean, the total number of medication, i.e. pills sold, the vast majority of those sort of pills sold are generic. The number of novel drugs as a percentage of pills or vials is relatively small.
Carol, we were having fun talking. I mean, I'm sure all of you were bored by the show Silicon Valley because it's basically all about you, right? So you don't want to watch that. But we were talking about an episode where there was a fired CEO and talking to another CEO, and I don't understand it because you're talking about levels of money and whatnot that are ridiculously out of my experience. But I'm interested in how you sort of framed it, that when one was looking at valuations, I do know we have a lot of entrepreneurs out here, that you said he made a sort of mistake, that he made a mistake in the pathway of thinking about what a kind of stable pathway to growing a business was.
So it's really around this idea of valuation. And at every stage of investment, Series A, B, C, of course, what you ideally want as the CEO and as the syndicate to see the company making progress and getting a valuation markup to represent that progress. But in private companies, it's sort of all a made-up number. And I think sometimes CEOs get carried away with this idea of, oh, I got a $200 million valuation. Isn't that awesome? If it's premature, it's terrible. Because if you can't live up to that valuation, you're probably going to be looking at a down round in the next round, and nobody likes down rounds. And so the Silicon Valley quip was this little bar scene where this CEO of a tech company was lamenting, oh, I just got fired because I took too high a valuation on the last round. We had to do a down round, and so the investors got rid of me. I had no idea I could have taken a lower valuation. And so it's this idea of you've got to, particularly in biopharma, play a really long game. And you have to think about the end in mind. And the other part about this is somebody ultimately has to sell that drug. And if the market is only sort of a revenue of 300 million versus $1 billion, and it costs 150 million to get there, you have to figure out how every investor class is going to be happy about their investment, and you have to work that out. So if you end up at too high a valuation, it doesn't work. So it's really about thinking carefully about the end game, working backwards, and trying to be as efficient as possible with your capital, get great investors that will stay with you and help you build your company, and valuation will come. It's just like we were talking about with unmet medical need. If you do something great for patients, the economics will work out. Yeah. So don't get so caught up with the ego of, oh, I need to have a 100% step up on this next round. That isn't how to think about it. It's the long game of how do I build my company.
Interesting. Julianne, let me ask you this question. I'm fascinated with Carol, and I'm not going to typecast her in this, but why do you think there are so few Carols out there in your industry, and what can be done to fix it?
Well, I mean, I don't know why. I don't know the answer why, but I do think that, historically there are probably, fewer women that end up going into science, fewer women that actually get recognized for the accomplishments that they have. It's not different from many other industries. Is it a problem, right? How do you go about fixing it? I tend to believe in fixing it far more organically, recognizing people for their accomplishments.
I mean, do you think about inclusion questions broadly in your work, in your company, or is this sort of a luxury for the bigger firms?
Yeah, so I was telling Carol the story sort of on the side. So you mentioned I'm the CEO of an Alzheimer's company. We started the company a couple years ago and started staffing it with scientists. And I was sitting with our CSO in late December, sort of looking at the org chart, and I noticed, kind of without actually knowing this, that 80% of our scientists were women. Without that being a pre-specified intent of any kind, without us going out and branding ourselves in that way. And Carol had asked me if it was because they knew one another and they helped recruit one another. In some cases, yes, but in many cases, no. So for me personally, I think that the approach when I'm building these companies is really you're trying to hire the best possible people that you have. And I think if you take take it as a meritocracy and you actually kind of drive it in that way, it's a much more organic way of doing things, and frankly, just a good way that I like to sort of live my life. Frankly.
Drew, thoughts on this?
When I graduated from medical school in 1990, the majority of the class was male. The majority of Cornell Medical School classes now is women. I agree with Leon. I think it happens organically. I have a female partner at ACELink. We have a female analyst. And I would imagine as years go by, those numbers are only going to increase. I think it happens organically. There are a number of, Carol, of course, is unique. So, but putting her uniqueness aside, I think the rest of it happens organically over time.
Carol, quick thoughts?
I think it's important to let it happen organically, but with an awareness, because I think we don't want the pendulum to go too far the other way, because it only hurts women and minorities if we end up putting somebody who isn't the best candidate for that job in the role. It will quickly fall down as an opportunity. And so it's all about a meritocracy, find the best people, but I do think get out of your network, push yourself to find talent wherever talent is.
I'd like to go to the audience in a moment, but very quick, rapid round. Pretend we've all signed non-disclosure agreements and tell us what you think your moonshot, if you were to sort of think about areas in this field, you're all pros in this, deeply up to your gills in what this area, where do you think the next big opportunities are? I'd love to hear just sort of if you were to sort of skyball this, spitball this, where would you go next other than where you are now?
Well, I like to focus on areas where people aren't. I think they're great innovations in oncology. You heard a lot of examples that are going on now. And, I tend to take the temperature by going to these therapeutic conferences that aren't so balmy with great news, right? That are somewhat depressing at some level because there's a lack.
What's
of
the most
innovation.
depressing conference you've been to
I mean,
recently?
there have been a few.
You wanna keep them
don't-
secret.
Don't want
Yeah.
to name names. But there are definitely some therapeutic areas where the pace of innovation just isn't there. And the things that, half the people there are physicians who are treating these patients, and you could see it on their face that they don't have a lot of options for their patients. And when they go to the conference, they're looking for the next big thing. And that next big thing doesn't look that exciting. I like to look at those particular areas, but then apply innovative technologies like the genomics revolution, for example. And this is how we came up with eScape and the Alzheimer's, is to take that as an example. You look at neurodegenerative disease, where there really are no options for Alzheimer's patients, Parkinson's patients that are disease modifying. And can we take innovations in discovering genetic markers, patient subpopulations, where you can make a difference for those people.
Right.
And I think that's that blending of that starts to bleed beyond oncology and orphan drug diseases and moving into things like CNS, renal disease, pulmonary diseases would be a very exciting sort of push to really recognize and create some value.
Carol?
I think I'm certainly interested in neurodegenerative diseases, so that's definitely a high one on my list. But I also think endocrine diseases that then span into orphan, I think are underrepresented. And then I would take that even as far to then go to such big issues as NASH. And so it's this whole challenge of how our metabolic state interacts with our endocrine state. And I think that is not an area that has been as much delved into in terms of company formation and opportunities.
Drew?
Well, they took all my good ideas.
Or you're a clever lurker.
I think, right, it's the sincerest form of flattery. I think that I agree. I think the central nervous system diseases first came imaging, and now with markers, we're doing a much better job of, I think, addressing, Leon talked about, Alzheimer's is still a difficult nut to crack. I'm hopeful he's going to crack it. Parkinson's, he mentioned, a number of other diseases. There was a company the other day that got sold that has a Parkinson's pump, which is extremely interesting. So I would expect that area, and depression. Time Magazine this week has a big article on depression. When I first graduated from medical school, everyone thought you were going to give people Prozac and everybody would be cured. That's not the case. I think there's a big opportunity there as well.
Great, thank you. Let me open up the floor to you. We got a gentleman right here in the middle.
Ben Miles from Transcriptic, we're a robotic cloud lab. I have an Adam Feuerstein tweet from yesterday. Biotech is in desperate need of a culling. You could probably kill 1/3 to 1/2 of publicly traded companies and be better for it. Agree? Disagree?
Ooh, interesting question. Publicly traded companies, kill them off, Carol?
I don't think so. I think what's been tremendous for the biopharma industry over the last 5 years is that we have had an IPO opportunity. And back to capital intensity, so we need the public investors to help us develop these drugs. And so it's been really important to be able to have access to that capital. So I don't see that at all, and I think there's been a number of great successes. Loxo is a great company that was started by a previous person that worked at Ainsley.
Provocative, though.
Very exciting.
Drew, you want to?
You know, I think it's really hard to separate the wheat from the chaff in that way. For instance, Pharmacyclics was a drug that was a company that had a lot of trouble for many years, and then it went on to develop one of the most important drugs in oncology. These things, as Carol said, they take time, they take capital. I think it's a provocative tweet. Take it as such, but
Interesting. Other questions, comments? Or I'm going to finish my. So let me ask you one. It's a little bit off in another field, but I at the Aspen Ideas Festival this year, which the Atlantic produces with the Aspen Institute, we had the head, I think, of global research for GSK there. So giant firm, largely in vaccines and other things. And as I understand, it's hard to make money in that area, but I don't quite believe them. But they're going to sell off their rare disease unit. And I found this fascinating, and I find the kind of broad question of structures. When you were just talking about orphan issues, I also worry about the next pandemic coming in and whether there's an infrastructure globally deployed that's paid for, and how to get at that nexus of large firms actually there, creating the science, working with universities, putting this in, which really is a public good, but also getting the balance with private gain. And I just want to tap your brains for what should we be doing on the international front that we're not doing? And are you worried?
I personally, I think it's a broader issue than just the international front. I think we have a lot of great alignment right now, as Carol mentioned earlier, in terms of economic incentives with respect to finding cures for diseases. I don't believe that alignment exists for preventative type of diseases. I think that when you look at the impact on public health that vaccines or other preventative types of treatments can provide, the economic incentives for those largely don't exist today, in my opinion. And I think if there's any place where there's an opportunity to sort of better align those incentives so cash will start flowing in that direction, that would have a tremendous impact on public health in the long run.
Very cool answer. I had no idea we were going to go. But Carol?
I think an example of this is what's been happening in infectious disease.
Yeah.
And so for quite a while in the sort of 2004, 5, 6, 7 timeframe, the FDA made it more challenging for companies to have a regulatory path to get novel antibiotics approved. And Congress responded and did the GAINS Act. And the GAINS Act not only created a better regulatory environment, but it also created government funds that can be grants to companies to help novel antibiotics get developed. And that's really important because we all know resistance continues to occur. It will occur. We haven't yet found a solution for that, so we definitely need new antibiotics. So I think that's an example where policy did change the whole environment, and there are a number of new antibiotic companies and new antibiotics that are being developed that we're going to all need someday with hospital-acquired infections.
Thank you. Drew, can you fix this problem?
I guess I could slightly restate what they said because I agree with both of them. I think that the FDA provides leadership around the globe in regulatory matters, and almost all other countries tend to reflect to some degree what the FDA has done. So it matters in other sovereign nations, whether they're in Africa or wherever they are, that they pay attention to what the FDA does. And those nations, as Leon said, they need to create sort of economic incentives. Now, GSK has a big franchise in HIV. They're in Africa. They're a global concern. For a smaller biotech company to sort of scale that height, so to speak, it takes a fair amount of time. First, they're coming in the US, then in Europe, so it takes a bit of time, but I just would concur with what they said.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please give Drew Schiff, Carol Gallagher, and Leon Chen a hand. Thank you very much for a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Steve. So far this morning, we've taken a broad look at the innovation landscape in the Bay Area. We've just met some leading investors, and now we're going to meet some people who are working on the front lines of scientific discovery. It's my pleasure to welcome Carrie Gunn, CEO and founder of Genelite, which has developed a blood testing technology that enables speedy and wide-ranging diagnoses. Welcome. Gabe Ott is CEO and co-founder of Freenome, a health technology company that does early disease detection. Lynn Seeley is CEO of Myovent Sciences, a global biopharmaceutical company focused on women's health.
Yeah.
And Sean Harper is Executive Vice President of Research and Development at Amgen, one of the world's largest biotech companies. And back to lead the conversation is my colleague, Alexis Madrigal.
Hello again. Hi, sit down, sit down. I've never actually had anyone do that. You guys are very polite. You're not going to start eating before everyone's at the table. So we have a variety of different perspectives, different companies, 3 CEOs, and an executive of a large pharmaceutical company. Why don't you give us your elevator pitch? Just kind of go right down the line, starting on that end and ending over here.
Yeah, sure. So my elevator pitch used to be, we can take a single drop of blood, do 128 diagnostic tests in less than 10 minutes in the doctor's office. But that just leads to a long conversation about a particular company. So,
which we'll have.
Thank you. I knew it would. So really what it is, it's about data. And so the place where medical decisions are being made is in the doctor's office. That drives all the expense. It drives all the outcomes, whether positive or negative, all the therapeutic decisions. Most of those are done based on conversations with the patients. So our whole job is to collect all of the data out of that patient sample we possibly can and deliver it back to the doctor in 15 minutes while that patient's still sitting right there in front of them.
Excellent. Gabe? Right.
I run Freenome. We develop non-invasive cancer screening methods powered by machine learning and traditional biotech lab technologies. So really, I guess the media calls it liquid biopsies. I really hate that terminology because it's wrong for so many reasons. But we like to think of ourselves as just detecting cancer at the earliest points possible using non-invasive methods.
I like this. Give us the rant on why liquid biopsy is the bad way of describing it.
Sure. I think for what we do, it's inaccurate, right? For what some of the other companies do, like Guardant, I think liquid biopsy is fine. But for sort of cancer screening, right, you're really trying to detect the tumor at the earliest points possible, whereas biopsies sort of give patients a suggestion that you're learning something about the molecular nature of that tumor and whether you have sort of that confirmatory nature of the tumor, whereas our test is not really that sort of final word, right? The invasive biopsy is still going to be sort of the final standard for a while in terms of whether somebody has cancer or not. Calling it liquid biopsy sort of give the patients this false conception that they can replace invasive biopsies with this new technology, which is not going to happen for a very long time. So I really think that, under the liquid biopsy branch, there's screening, there's sort of more traditional diagnostics, and then there's like patient monitoring and various different things that answer different questions. And to put that all under the umbrella of liquid biopsies is irresponsible, I think, both to the patients and to the clinicians that you're trying to sell the test to.
Like starting with a note of humility. All right, Lynn, you're up.
Sure. I'm the CEO of Myovant Sciences. We're a biopharmaceutical company focused on women's health and endocrine diseases. We're in late stage phase 3 clinical development, evaluating an oral once-a-day treatment for women with heavy menstrual bleeding from uterine fibroids, women suffering from endometriosis-associated pain, and also for men with advanced prostate cancer. And then we also have a second drug for women with infertility who we're developing as part of assisted reproduction. Our mission is to become a global leader in women's health, bringing innovative treatments for those areas that women suffer from that have been ignored by big pharma. We are currently really focused on transforming the treatment of endometriosis and uterine fibroids, diseases which are treated with surgery and invasive procedures. We'd like to have them be treated with medicine, a pill. And that will give the hundreds of thousands of women who undergo hysterectomy each year a medical alternative.
Are there any other biotech firms that are specifically focused on developing drugs for women?
There are, but they are very few and far between, so I can sort of name them on one hand. This is a wide open space, and so when I was looking around for what I wanted to do as a CEO, immuno-oncology is very exciting, but it is so crowded. Here, half the population are women. They are suffering, often in silence, because these diseases are embarrassing and nobody wants to talk about them, and there is wide open space, so a real opportunity to make a difference.
Sean, tell us what you do at Amgen.
So I'm head of research and development, and we focus in a pretty wide area of therapeutic areas these days. Our major focus in drug discovery and development these days is having a kind of biology first, modality second approach where we seek to have as much human validation of our drug targets as possible by looking at the experiments of nature that exist in population genetics and having insight into biochemical pathways by studying the kind of variants that occur in the population that are attributable to disease risk. And that's something that we've pioneered in the industry in terms of having it be an industrial approach for the way that we're approaching discovery and drug development. We have traditional areas we work in, nephrology, inflammation, supportive care oncology, bone health. We're branching out now into launching products in the cardiovascular and neuroscience spaces lately.
All right, Carrie, let's get right into it. Let's talk about Theranos.
All right.
I assume you get this question a lot because you also have a one-drop blood testing.
Usually no more than once an hour.
Yes, right. Yeah. So what can be learned from the Theranos experience?
So let me, so I could go on for hours, but let me take the unusual stance of defending Theranos, okay? Because it's really a good idea, right? It needs to happen. And so the vision of being able to take diagnostics out of the existing environment and the way it's done today is a great one. So I like to make the argument all the time that today's diagnostic system is broken. We are killing patients because we put blood samples in Ford Fiestas, we drive them across town, we FedEx them or fly them to North Carolina or other places, and it takes several days for that sample to get back, and then it's lost. So there's a huge number of malpractice cases that are because that the test is performed correctly, but it's never communicated back to the patient. A lot of patients don't go to the lab when they're asked to. No matter how hard you try in your healthcare system, you can move it up to about 80% of patients are actually compliant with the diagnostic testing order. And every day I talk to physicians and say, hey, I've got this patient on this drug. I might be wrecking their kidneys, but I think they really need the drug, and I just can't get them to go to the lab. Right? What do I do about that? So the idea of decentralizing diagnostics and getting the data in the doctor's hands a lot faster, I think, is a great idea. And I like to thank the vision of Theranos and where they went, because every major healthcare system has sat down and thought about Theranos, right? They put a tiger team on it and said, hey, what could we do with this? And most of them concluded that, hey, we might be saving a nickel by sending it to Quest or LabCorp, but we're costing ourselves hundreds of dollars per patient over here in terms of physician efficiency and medical mistakes and follow-up phone calls and patients that just don't go to the lab. So in the end, what Theranos was trying to do is really a good thing.
Gabe,
We're just going to do it right.
Yeah. Gabe, do you take any lessons from it as someone who's taken money from traditional or a big VC firm and has maybe some of the expectations and weight that come with backing from a company like that?
Sure. I think that by and large, the effect of Theranos has been good on the space. I don't think, so we haven't done a sort of single financing round without having to show data on our assay and the current state of development. And I think that's largely a reaction to companies like Theranos. They were able to raise millions, hundreds of millions of dollars without showing people real data, right? And I think, I would like to think that because of the Theranos event, that more and more investors are going to now do sort of better diligence on this sort of scientific data. That being said, I still hear about companies raising hundreds of millions of dollars, $1 billion without showing data. So I do think net positive effect has been this better diligence. I hope that it continues because people's memory tends to be really short, and I think we have a tendency of trying to move things very fast in sort of venture-backed companies. So I hope that we don't sort of default back into this what's easy of not doing the proper diligence.
Mm-hmm. Lynn, did you want to say something?
I guess if I had a comment, I'm just sad that she was a woman. I think there are not enough women CEOs, and I will tell you, 2 out of 3 times when I'm on a plane and somebody asks me what I do, the next comment is Theranos.
Right,
so
right.
I'm kind of sad for that, but.
Yeah, fair enough. Sean, from your perspective within this sort of large organization?
Well, we, of course, interact with an enormous spectrum of companies in both in small company kind of land with diagnostics, therapeutics, et cetera. And what you see is a kind of bell-shaped curve of biologic variation in the hype, right? So, that you just have to recognize that curve exists, and that, it's really just the bottom tail of that bell curve that is represented by this kind of situation where people are overhyping a technology in the way that occurred at Theranos. But you have to have your guard up, and the point about the diligence is important, and people do get carried away with the idea of doing something that is actually a great idea, but maybe lots of smart people have been working on the problem for a long time, and the idea that some small group of people suddenly have figured out how to do it overnight in a garage might not be true.
So we have some people up here who work on diagnostics and people who work on therapies. Do you see a lot of overlap between those communities, or do you find that people sort of focus on one or the other through their careers and through your companies?
I think more and more it's becoming clear that therapeutics and diagnostics sort of go hand in hand. What happened to BMS last year is a great example of this, where they had a trial that failed, mostly because I think they did a poor job of handling sort of the inclusion-exclusion criteria in their trials, which probably should have been done with some kind of companion diagnostic. I think the need for sort of more diagnostics that are paired with therapeutics so that right people get the right care is becoming very evident, and something that traditionally we haven't done as well as an industry. So I do believe that we are heading into a future where more pairs of diagnostics that are therapeutics are going to happen.
I would agree with, I think traditionally they have been quite separate. More and more there is a push to move them together as we're talking about personalized medicine. And I'll give the example of I'm developing a therapeutic, or Myovant's developing a therapeutic for endometriosis. This disease is diagnosed today by an invasive laparoscopy, and so these young women who are suffering can wait for diagnosis for 7 to 10 years. And if there could be a blood test that could do this for them, they could be diagnosed right away instead of having years where they're wondering what's wrong with them. Doctors can't diagnose them. Maybe it's in their head. So I think diagnostics are incredibly important, but obviously then they need to be followed with the right therapeutic.
Yeah, and diagnostics is cheap. It's really, really cheap. And so the thing that's always, I guess, puzzled me is that there's a pressure on cost, obviously, across the entire healthcare system to reduce cost. But if you quit investing in the insightful data required to drive therapy, you're going to end up with a much more expensive healthcare system in the end. And I think that's what's starting to be realized, is that you can invest in data collection and insight into what's going on in that patient through a diagnostic and make much better decisions about a drug, much better targeted therapy, less side effects, et cetera. So that mentality is starting to creep in, but it hasn't been there historically.
What do you attribute that underinvestment to?
There's no multi-billion-dollar exits in diagnostics. There are in therapeutics. So when you talk to a healthcare investor, and I've done this for years, you walk in and say, hey, we got this great, technology. It's a diagnostic. Sorry, my partners just won't let me touch that.
How about over here? Do you think there's underinvestment in diagnostics?
Well, I think, there's a couple areas where the convergence that we were hearing about between the therapeutics and diagnostics is clearly happening, and it's mainly oncology and infectious diseases. There's much less of that kind of opportunity today in the state of the art in any other therapeutic area. So you tend to have a separation. The business models are very different. The margins are very different. So companies that are focused in human therapeutics find the diagnostics work to be something that they don't really want to get into as a business. I mean, the only real exception is Roche Genentech, and I'd argue that it's yet to be clear that they've had the synergy that they're expecting between those two areas. So I think that it'll come over time. It'll be spearheaded, by these areas where it's becoming routine to have some kind of patient stratification marker. But I still think when you look out there in the space, there are diagnostics companies and there are therapeutic companies, and that's not going to change for a while.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about some of your stories as CEOs. Let's talk about, Gabe, you have software background, and the technology that your company is based around did not spin out of UCSF. Can you talk about founding, what's kind of a different kind of biotechnology company? Obviously there are others, but
Sure.
It's maybe not the most traditional pathway.
Yeah, our path to forming a company was very non-traditional. As you say, we were not spun out of a university. Our IP was all generated in-house. In retrospect, that was probably a big mistake, I would say, because the first, I think, 6 months of the company's life was really the founders going door to door to various PIs at universities, just asking for samples so that we could do research. And I think, that's a really difficult place to sort of start from, because no one trusts you when you have zero track record, right? And you're wanting to do the research right, but if you don't have the samples, that's almost impossible to do. The reason why so many companies spin out of IP that was generated at universities is the universities do have those samples that they can do research on, and a lot of the initial research is done by the time the company gets spun out. So I think in that way, I think it was really interesting. I think there were benefits to that, though, which was that once we were able to get samples, which a couple of professors really, I think, took a shot on us to sort of work with us to develop the initial IP, there was no latitude given to us for any sort of subsequent meetings, right? We had to go data first, otherwise they wouldn't listen to us. As you say, I don't have sort of an advanced degree, MD or PhD, so there was no benefit of doubt given to me in that regard. And then there was also the fact that we were not spun out of the university, so we didn't automatically have KOLs that would sort of speak on our behalf immediately. So I think the combination of those reasons really formed a different type of company where we are always telling people sort of in-house, where's the evidence, right? Where's the data for any of the claims that they're making? Partly because that was how we were born as a company. And that's the way we've approached investors. That's the way we've approached KOLs. That's the way we currently approach any partners that we're working with.
And Lynn, I want to talk to you a little bit. Just when we were in the back, we're talking about the diversity and inclusion conversation that has been happening in the straight tech industry, and the similar conversation is occurring in biotech, and you had some interesting numbers. And the context for this is that in tech a lot of the times, and I think you hear a little bit less of this now, but for a long time you heard it's just a pipeline. That like if there were more women inside tech companies, there'd be more women running tech companies and founding tech companies. And what's your experience been in the biotech world?
So I think people know the problem in high tech, but not so much in biotech. And the fact of the matter is, in biotech, the life sciences, 50% of the workforce are women. But you don't see that in the leadership. And in fact, if you look at pharma, 16% of the executive committees are women. And so you say, well, that's just big pharma, that's old school. Well, it's not true. If you look in 2014, of the companies going public, the number was 19% were women in the leadership roles. And so even though 50% of the workforce are women, you're not seeing this translate into the senior positions. And so that's why we need more women on boards, and there's been a big push for that. We need more women in leadership roles, and we have to be very proactive about it. And I'll just tell my personal story, which was eye-opening for me, and I've been a woman in this business for a very long time. And I left Medivation after being chief medical officer for a decade, had a wonderful career, was started as a third employee, built that company to a very successful company, and I didn't get a single CEO offer. I got lots and lots of chief medical officers after I stepped out, but I didn't get a single CEO offer until I self-declared. And finally, I told somebody, look, I've got another operating role in me, but I want to be CEO if I'm going to do it. Once I self-declared, I had no problem. Isn't that interesting? A lot of opportunity. So I think there's still a need for women to self-advocate and for people to ask. We're not as likely to sort of volunteer ourselves.
Let's stay on your sort of CEO and corporate structure right now. So my event is part of Roivant Sciences. Maybe you can just sort of describe the kind of operating structure there, or how it all works.
Well, I think everybody here is trying to do drug development more quickly, more efficiently. And so as I was looking around at opportunities, I came across this company, Roivant Sciences, which is a very unusual company which prides itself on value creation. And what they do is they look for undervalued assets in big pharma, maybe in academia, where they don't have the opportunity to take it to the next level. And they bring them in, they in-license them, and they organize them into companies that are sort of therapeutically focused. And so I met Vivek Ramaswamy, 31-year-old, who heads up Roivant Sciences, right as he was looking at doing diligence on 2 drugs from Takeda, which are ultimately the 2 drugs that were brought in to Myovant. And we formed this company. I was employee number 1 just a little over a year ago, and now we've got 5 phase 3 global clinical trials running. How could we do that? Because they have this model where the team that does diligence becomes the development team, and then they provide support as we get our company up and going. And so they supported us while we took the company public and raised money, gave us the staff so that we could quick start, if you will. And now we've hired our own team and we're up and running much more independently, and they're our major investor, shareholder. So it's a wonderful, innovative model to speed up drug development.
Let's go, because we want to talk about some of these moonshots. Kind of a lightning round, so we'll go kind of quickly. But like, what would you say, let's go 10 years out. What's something you would like to see that's on the market, or you expect to see that's on the market that would be surprising to people in innovation? Maybe we'll start on this end and go this way this time.
Well, I think there's great promise in that time frame in having the artificial intelligence kind of machine-based learning applied to the system's biology of cells, tissues, disease, so that we can become a little bit more of an engineering-based discipline rather than one that is operating with fragments of information without a wiring diagram, if you will, of the system that we're trying to troubleshoot and correct.
So get your questions ready, because when we get to the end, we're coming to you.
I guess I'm hoping to a place where really technology, and this is why I love the Bay Area, some of the digital technology and the information technology gets much more embedded into biotech, and so the way we run our clinical trials completely changes, and that we're seeing patients where they are, they're able to bring us data much more quickly, and then ultimately patient care is done much more out of the home and much easier for the patient than it is now.
I think traditionally, I think we touched on this briefly, but traditionally diagnostics has been that ugly duckling of biotech that no one really wanted to touch or fund because the ROIs are really low. I think we're seeing a shift in that in this age, especially in sort of in spaces like cancer screening where the space is really big. But I do think that there is sort of a missing piece if we're talking 10 years down the road where we just need better sensors and better sort of ways of getting data. Right, instead of a blood draw, like we should be able to get continued sort of sensor data that we can learn from to diagnose these diseases earlier and earlier. And I don't think that's really going to happen with sort of the current level of technology and sensors. And I hope that this renewed interest in diagnostics really spurs on a new generation of innovation, not only on the software side, but also on the hardware side that will enable new ways of capturing data continuously.
Cool.
Great. In 10 years, I think everyone is going to be tested for every single diagnostic test every time they touch the healthcare system. And computers and analytics are going to be able to handle that large stream of data in an intelligent way and help doctors make better decisions, lead to better patient outcomes.
All right. Looks like we've got a question right here.
Yes. Hi, I'm Phil Polikoff of Stanford University. What's your reflections on the World Health Organization's definition of health in 1948? Health is the state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely just the absence of disease or infirmity.
I'd say my gut reaction to that statement is if you look at the incidence of inflammation and autoimmune disease in the Western worlds, it's skyrocketing. And why is that? These are stress-mediated diseases. They're mediated by things in our environment. What's causing that, no one knows today. But there's something about the modern world. The more Western the world is, the more allergy, the more autoimmune disease happens. And so there's an element to progress which challenges that definition of health.
Anybody else?
I mean, I think that definition of health speaks to something that needs to happen in healthcare that currently hasn't happened in sort of the Western medicine, especially in the United States, where we should be moving really towards preventative medicine as opposed to sort of this acute intervention that the entire system is sort of built around right now. And I think if we make a push, and this is going to take everything, it's going to take technology development, it's going to take patient behavior change in order to make this happen. But we should really be focused on how do we keep people healthier longer rather than what do we do about it when they get sick.
Okay, hi. I'm Irene Oyanahu. I am from Big Health. So my question is, what is preventing the multi-billion-dollar exit in diagnostics? if something can prevent or cure cancer early, that sounds pretty valuable to me.
I think cancer screening is the biggest exception to the rule of diagnostics, right? If you're talking about just the number of people that should be getting colonoscopies that don't this year in the United States is 35 million people, right? Those kinds of sort of numbers of people that should be taking a particular diagnostic is very rare. And I think that as we sort of, again, go head towards more into sort of preventative medicine, in spaces as big as cancer, where the population incidence numbers are really high, I think we will see opportunities in diagnostics that have these high return on investments, but traditionally that hasn't been the case.
Last one, right here.
Sure. We've heard a lot about venture capital and investing, but wanted to know if somebody could speak to the role of big philanthropies are playing in biomedical research and the role they can play, say, in fixing certain market problems.
Well, I guess maybe I'd like to see them play a bigger role, because I think there are ways that philanthropies and drug development companies, therapeutic companies can potentially work together to maybe get medicines to the right places where they're not going because maybe the markets aren't there, but the philanthropy might be there to help these companies focus on areas which are traditionally underserved. There are ways where maybe the financial incentives aren't quite aligned, but with philanthropy and the know-how of the companies, you could do some really important things. So I think there's a major role for it.
All right, join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carrie, Gabe, Lynn, and Sean, and thank you, Alexis. A question. How many people in this room are wearing a Fitbit? How many people have worn a Fitbit? And how many people are close to somebody who is constantly telling you how many miles they've clocked on their Fitbit? So it's a nice showing of the growing consumer appetite for personal health data, and that knowledge seems to be empowering for people. I'm not sure, I didn't see quite as many hands as I expected. I can't tell you how many people I see on the East Coast walking around sort of looking at their wrists, seeing how many miles they've done. Our next conversation will feature a company that hopes to be a one-stop shop for anyone interested in their personal genomics, providing data about everything from how you should eat, exercise, or plan your family. With that, it's my pleasure to welcome Robin Thurston, CEO of Helix, and here to lead the conversation is Christina Farr, health and technology reporter at CNBC. Christina, hello.
Hi. Hello.
Take it away.
Thanks for having us. How's everyone doing today? Seems like great energy. I'm excited. So our topic is what consumers want, which kind of makes me think about that Mel Gibson movie, What Women Want.
I'm not sure we'll be able to answer all that today.
I don't think Mel Gibson could either. So what do consumers want? Do they want healthcare? I mean, and that might seem like a really simple question, but you know, as someone who is relatively healthy, I'm not really thinking about my health on an active basis, and I kind of don't want to. I just want to live my life.
Yeah, I guess I think back a little bit to 10 years ago when the App Store first launched. My previous company, MapMyFitness, I remember going out and visiting with investors, and people were like, "No one's going to run with their phone. Like, why do you think this is a good idea?" And I was like, no, everyone's going to run with their phone. Everyone is.
I do look pretty dorky, kind of like holding my phone like
yeah,
this.
but you got your music, you got your safety, etc. And I think there was a sort of a feeling that quantified self was something that was really, really narrow, that was only going to be this really small group of people. And I think what's happening is this sort of shift from really reactive healthcare to proactive means that hopefully we can integrate it seamlessly into our lives in a way that really everybody wants it at some level.
And we hear this a lot, this whole idea of the consumerization of healthcare. Do you like that term? Are we consumers when we are in this sort of healthcare setting, or are we something else? Because it's not like buying an iPhone when you are a consumer of health. You have all these other things to worry about. Staying healthy is a totally different equation and often not a rational choice.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it is hard to deem it that way because you think about, like, as an example, my father has type 2 diabetes, and I don't think he thinks about it like buying a consumer product. You know what I mean? Like, it's a very, very different experience for him, and it's very real every day, right? Because he has to take insulin and all these things. But I think for the average consumer, the question is how do you integrate it so seamlessly that it's something that you actually, don't necessarily consume the way you would go to, Target and buy a product or something like that, but something that literally is sort of integrated into your lifestyle.
And that's what you're hoping to do with your new company, Helix, which seems like a totally futuristic idea, but it's, here today, this whole notion that we could even potentially start to use genetics to sell products and to tailor and personalize products.
Yeah, so I mean, Helix really is we hope a revolutionary idea that, someone can sequence once their, in our case, an exome or a full protein coding area of your genome, and then use that over and over. But I think the important thing from a, sort of consumer perspective is that getting a report all at once that has everything in it isn't really the way people digest anything or consume anything, right? They tend to go utilize things that are important to them, at that moment or that they have an interest in, and then learn about that area and then potentially move on to something else. And I think the idea of the Helix platform is that we don't actually know which categories and which things might be most interesting to someone, and that they're going to come in from all of these different areas. And that's where they're going to start their journey about learning about whether it's, healthcare in general or their health in general, to maybe a very specific topic like, as an example, Venome that, will tell you your taste genetics and what wine you might like.
Based on your DNA.
Based on your DNA, yes.
So I'm curious from the audience, how many people have ever had their DNA sequenced? Oh, wow. It's quite a lot. And when I guess, when I say DNA sequence, I don't know whether I would include things like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, because they're doing something different, which is genotyping, right?
Yes. So I think Jay Flatley, our chairman, said it best last week that in a perfect world, specifically in thinking about consumer products, you really would even do the full genome. Right, that if the cost was no issue or the cost was zero, you certainly would try to get all of the data so that you could build and understand as much of it as possible. Realistically, microarrays exist because they were the best cost option to start building products, and Helix is really in a position to offer the full exome at a price we think is consumer friendly for the first time at scale. And so I think, even if you think about the technology today on your phone, you probably wouldn't go out and buy a camera from 10 years ago on your phone as a consumer. You really would want the latest and greatest camera phone and product in the market. And I think that's really the difference between microarrays and where, we're headed with exome and I think eventually full genome.
So I was looking at the new site a few days ago, because you guys just launched it, right?
Just launched, yeah.
And it was about $80 for the first time sequencing, and then you guys were charging kind of a mix. It was anywhere from like $100 to $500 for all of these different applications, and it was kind of like the App Store, but for genetics.
Yeah.
So how did you get to that price point? Because it's, if I try to get my exome or genome sequenced anywhere else, it would be a couple grand.
Yeah. So we are subsidizing to essentially get people onto the platform and try their very first product and learn, in the first step, whether that's in, fitness, ancestry, nutrition, whatever it might be. That $80 kit price is really the threshold we felt like consumers would have to be at to say, hey, this is something that I want to do. But like the App Store, we don't actually set the other prices. So the partners that are on the platform get to set their own prices, and then similar to the App Store, we revenue share with them on that product price.
And those partners, you had, some folks that were doing healthcare testing, which we've all seen before. But then there was a company that would put my DNA on a scarf in the fashion category.
Yeah.
So which do you think will drive consumer adoption more? Is it going to be the sort of fun ideas or more of the sort of medical, important stuff that you would need to know for your health?
Well, I think the market's already proved out that health and ancestry are going to be big categories here. You know, from the space I was in fitness nutrition, I clearly believe those will be big categories, especially as more and more new discovery happens as you marry this phenotype and genetic data together. But I think the important part about a true, you know, sort of app store is that you don't actually know what the consumer wants, and you actually have to offer diversity and breadth to make it possible to understand where all those consumers might come from, and also to make it a reoccurring thing. I mean, if you think about, you know, certainly when you know, Apple or Google launched, you know, no one knew really that Uber or Airbnb or MapMyFitness, frankly, were going to exist. But part of the reason everyone in this room keeps going back to the App Store is because it's complete, that there are things across a very wide spectrum for you to choose from and try over and over and over. And I believe that Helix has to offer a similar type of situation from a consumer standpoint.
And have you tried any of this stuff? Like, do you have your DNA on a scarf?
I did order my scarf. I think this will be a big Christmas item for sure. It's super cool. I mean, the company's really amazing. But I think the products, from my perspective, I mean, I'm a cyclist. You know, I have been sort of in the fitness, you know, nutrition category. But I think the products that are most exciting are the ones that are starting to look at, you know, that are merging the genetics with Helix, biome, blood, all together. Because I think that perspective starts to give the consumer some really interesting insights that are, you know, have double confirmation, really start to tell them something about, you know, how they might change behavior on a day-to-day, you know, week-to-week, month-to-month basis.
And a lot of us still have some concerns about sequencing our DNA. This is really sensitive health information, and we do have some laws that protect us from things like discrimination, but it's not totally complete, and there is this loophole with life insurance and disabilities and so on.
Sure.
How are you educating people on that, and how are you getting people to overcome some of those fears and use the platform?
So, you know, first of all, it's I have this saying that I use internally a lot, which is I do think it's important for us to, you know, really talk to the consumer regularly about not only what are we doing with the data and how it's potentially going to be used, and how and what parts of the data the partners are potentially going to get and be able to use, and then they have to be very clear about it. So, you know, whether we're working very closely with things like consent or research consent that the partners might be using, how we might be using it. But I ultimately, like, you know, I think every company would say the same thing about protecting data. They'd say, we're doing everything we can. It's the biggest deal inside the company. My feeling is that, you know, trust, which ultimately this is what it comes down to, is, you know, earned in drops and lost in buckets. Right? I mean, that's what happens, right? So we have to do everything we can to slowly build up that trust with the consumer and make sure that our partners are doing the same, because clearly it's the most sensitive data from my perspective that you know, potentially could be out there.
And speaking of data, who owns it? Do you guys own it? Do I own it? And can I get it back?
So we certainly have a position that the consumer owns it. As I said, we are subsidizing the cost of running your exome up front. So right now we're working on functionality where the consumer could download their full exome, pay the essentially retail price for that, and take it wherever they want, wherever they might use that. We do obviously own a copy of that, and then once the consumer buys the partner product, that partner then asks the consumer the right to take that portion of the data that they're using inside of that product specifically.
Got it. And you know, you were before Helix, because you joined about a year ago, right?
Just a little bit over a year ago. Yeah.
So you worked for Under Armour, and they had just acquired your company, MapMyFitness.
Yep.
So in that journey, what have you learned about what consumers want and don't want? Is there any big surprises that you could share? You know, something that you assume that consumers want that they in fact don't? Anything to kind of help out our audience?
I think I go back a lot to the idea that I do believe consumers want seamless integration. I mean, I think you know, one of the things I realized at MapMyFitness maybe 3 or 4 years in was, often products and services will just keep adding functionality to them. They just like, hey, let's pile on the next thing that we're going to layer in front of the consumer and hope that you can then tell that story. We started to sort of curate and actually take stuff out of the product. So I do believe in this idea of simplicity and really being narrow about what it is that you're offering that the consumer can digest. Like that's kind of what I go back to even on the Helix platform. Like we could have launched, it could have been a company where we launched our own product in the market and just basically put everything out there possible in every different vertical. But I just, again, don't believe that's how consumers want to digest this, whether it's this information, healthcare, or consumer products. If you look at the hardware that Under Armour launched, even there we tried to basically take things out. Other companies were adding more and more functionality to wearables. We were actually trying to take things out to make it even more simple, for the consumer to use on a day-to-day basis.
So, as a reporter, I've had a lot of people speculate to me that wearables are dead. Mm-hmm. And as someone who worked in wearables and built those products for Under Armour, what do you have to say about that? Do you think that the wearables trend is coming to a close, or do you think that there is sort of a next opportunity?
I speculated a lot when I was there. I think I mentioned this on the phone, that I think what's going to happen with wearables is that it's going to turn into real wearables. I mean, the true wearable is what all of you have on, which is your clothes, right? And so as technology gets better and better, smaller and smaller, it will integrate into these lifestyles. Like the product that's actually doing the best that we built was integration of the chip data into the shoe. Completely seamless. Like basically you could go for a run, you didn't even need to take your watch, anything, and it would sync the data when you got back. But it was just a shoe. You couldn't see the technology at all. The consumer didn't have to think about putting on something, hitting a start button, anything. It just started on its own, ran while you were out, and then synced up to your phone afterwards, and you had data when you were there. I think those types of products are the products that I believe are going to be, really integrated into everything. I mean, literally everything.
I mean, one of the best quotes that I've heard on kind of wearables is they either have to be invisible, so like integrated into the clothing, or beautiful, so you'd be proud to wear them.
Yeah, I definitely 100% agree with that. I mean, even if you, in Fitbit's world, if you look at some of the stuff they did with, Tory Burch and others, I really thought that was the trend that was going to happen. I mean, even the acquisitions of like Fossil with Misfit, like I think all of that sort of merging together is certainly what we're going to see.
Does anyone here have a wearable in a file drawer right now?
I have a few.
So we're getting close to questions, so think of the stuff. But we talked about this backstage, and I told you I would ask you, if you had unlimited resources to do anything in healthcare and life sciences, I just gave you the money right now, what would you do? What would be your moonshot?
Unlimited. I really think this idea of bringing all of the data together in a very seamless way. So I think, part of our challenge in health and fitness, all these things on a day-to-day basis, is we actually don't have all the data, and we certainly don't have all of the lifestyle data merged with the workout data, merged with the blood data, the genetics data, all of these things. And I think the moonshot is really the people that will be able to bring all of this together in an extremely seamless way that then looks across large populations that can tell us things that we simply haven't discovered yet. I believe that is where the future is headed.
Actually, a lot of my reporting indicates that Apple and Amazon are moving into this area as well, of wanting to integrate health data together. Any thoughts on that? And you don't have to confirm anything.
I don't know that much about. I mean, other than what I read in your articles about what's going on at these companies. But it makes sense to me. It makes sense that what you've seen Apple do with HealthKit and things like ResearchKit, et cetera, that, they are trying to bring as much of that data, because they certainly have the big missing piece, which is the lifestyle data, because most of you, I mean, how many of you have your phones at least 16 to 18 hours a day on yourself? How many? Yeah, I mean, so the lifestyle data is largely there, and then, you see acquisitions they just did like Bedit, to get even, your sleep data. So I think it's all moving in this direction where,
the medical record on the phone.
Everything all into
and in
one
the cloud.
spot. Yeah, and I think that data is the transformational data.
Great.
I guess I would consider Apple or Google and or Amazon and Apple having unlimited resources for a moonshot.
That they do. So does anyone have any questions?
David Hansel, Naked Biome. One of the best things about the App Store is the overwhelming majority of apps are free. Is Helix going to provide some dribbles of free information from the exome as time goes on?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly talked a lot about what are the types of products that we offer, almost what I'd say is pre-sequencing in some ways, right? And then other small pieces of information that might be integrated into brands. Maybe a very simplistic one might be something like caffeine metabolism, that, a lot of people in this room probably shouldn't drink coffee after maybe, 2, 3 p.m. in the afternoon, even though you might like to, might disrupt your sleep, and then you don't feel good over time. I think you will see small bits, but again, always approved by the consumer in those other experiences that might be accessible across a large number of applications.
Hi, my name is Laura Yeses, and my question for you is what to do with difficult data. So some of the information that people are going to get back after they do one of these tests might be something that is quite disturbing and perhaps not actionable. Is there any plan or services to go along with the tests?
Yeah, so we actually have a partnership with a company called Genome Medical that essentially we're making available genetic counselors that somebody could call and talk to about all the products. So we're training them in all of the products on their platform, and we'll make that essentially in real, if the person wants to call right away after they get some result from, again, whether it's a nutrition company or it's a health company, that they would be able to get that information quickly. I think the other part, though, is how do you really build communities where people have and can access and start to ask, in some ways, even their community questions about it. And so, how do we open that up at some level? But I think our first step is really offering these genetic counselors as a way for people to ask questions in real time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here today. We had a great conversation.
Thank you.
And let's definitely keep in touch. If anyone has
Awesome.
any more questions, you'll be sticking around?
I'll be around.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you, Christina. From personal data to big data now, with the rise of big data, computer scientists and physicians are joining forces to create a more streamlined and digitized healthcare experience. How are researchers, doctors, and computer scientists collaborating to transform the future of health? To illuminate these issues in our final conversation, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Robert Califf, advisor to Google's Verily Life Sciences, professor of medicine at Duke University, and former FDA commissioner. Welcome, doctor.
Thanks.
And welcome back to my colleague, Steve Clemens. Here to
Thank you,
lead the
Margaret.
conversation.
Hi, everybody. Rob, I want to start off the conversation in a slightly different direction. As we were chatting before, that some of the discussion today, in a way, was sort of comparing what's happening in San Francisco to what's happening in Boston, and that there's this level of innovation and dynamism, at kind of a certain tier. And so I want to ask you something about, say, compare what's going on here in the innovation side to Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Lexington, Kentucky, and how, when you talk about data actually impacting the real health outcomes of people, what are we missing in this conversation that needs to be part of it?
Did you mean to say arrogance and snobbishness, or did you say
a little bit? I'm going to let you go there.
Innovation and creativity.
Yeah.
No, it's pretty clear now. If you look at a whole series of papers from the group in Seattle, Chris Murray's group, funded by the Gates Foundation. They started out with 8 Americas, and the key finding was that African American men on average live about 2 decades shorter than Asian women. And then in between, when you look at sex and race and ethnicity, there's a spectrum. We're now evolving into a more clearly distinct 2 Americas. And this is really based on economic situation, education, and lifestyle. And they have these beautiful maps now that show county by county what's happening in the United States. And we have one America where people are living better, they're jogging. If you look at their search information on Google, they're searching 401k, jogging, gifts for relatives. And you have another America which is actually going the wrong way in life expectancy. And in fact, the average in America for the first time in decades is going in the wrong direction. So I'm excited to hear about all the great things happening in Boston and the Bay Area, but frankly, a lot of the rest of America is not enjoying the benefits of all this
What do you think is driving it? Because you had almost you jumped back when I used the word access. Is access a problem? You said, look, access is a silly illusion. What is the way to begin talking in a more fundamental way, in a more constructive way, about bringing, having a more inclusive health picture?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is just my opinion, but I mean, I think it's hard to argue that access is really the issue or availability of knowledge. Almost everybody in the poorest county in the United States is carrying a cell phone that has internet access, so you can reach almost any piece of knowledge that you want to get. It's really the way the information is intersecting with the culture in America, and I think the internet is being used to purvey non-expert, in some cases non-truthful information using behavioral economics in a way which is relatively easy, which is, and I heard a little bit of it today, consumers want things right away. If you think about it, most things that are good for your health actually involve executive function of not having immediate gratification. Maybe you love to go running up to Presidio like I heard you're going to do this afternoon.
Anybody want to go?
But I'll bet that you're doing it because you have a health reason to do it. And if you had an option to go to the art museum, you'd rather do that.
So you're now with Verily, and you were Barack Obama's last FDA commissioner. You're now at Verily. You're a cardiologist, and I'm intrigued with this Project Baseline, which, as I understand it, you're trying to take people where they are, health baseline and data, and come out of this with something. So take us down that rabbit hole for a minute and tell us what the experience across these different platforms is leading to now in Project Baseline.
Well, this goes back about 10 or 15 years when I first met Andy Conrad, who's now the CEO of Verily.
I have to say that I was reading about this guy, Andy Conrad, and you're rumored to be the only one who can work well with him.
That's just not the case. Yeah. Like, Verily's doing quite well. He is a passionate guy who has opinions, and one of his opinions going way back, he was the chief medical officer for LabCorp. He was one of the first people to isolate hepatitis C virus diagnostically, which made him a fortune at a very young age, and it's enabled him, I think, to think very broadly. But I was coming as a clinician. He was a laboratorian scientist, and we were commiserating over the fact that up until now, we've all been looking at a slice of the elephant. So I have this image of the blind man and the elephant as the way science has been done. And I think it's come up over and over in the discussion this morning. Why is the failure rate 92% for drugs that make it into human studies, for example? And so we were surmising that science would get to the point in computing where you could look at least a fuzzy image of the whole elephant, the whole human being. And so we started designing the baseline study before I went to FDA. And I think we've hit the wave just right, because enrollment now has just started in the last few months.
You're hitting how many people are you trying to get?
10,000 to start.
Okay.
But remember, so 10,000 with very deep, multidimensional information. Genetics, genomics, integrative biology. The latest watch that's being developed measures 17 parameters continuously.
I'd like to volunteer Margaret Lowe over here for the study.
And then, we have the traditional medical data from the electronic health records, and then the social information, which is very important, and with consent from the participants, a lot of interaction. This is not research subjects, it's actual participants in the study.
So is this all under kind of Verily's tent? And when you talk about electronic health records, are they all within your world? So you're solving the problems of inconsistency and reporting and what I hear, the subjective bias problems in reporting with other records? Like I hear it just sort of a mess out there when you look at sort of the data side of it. So are you solving that internally, and does that then become some sort of framework that others will eventually be able to mimic?
Yeah, so this is a joint effort, Verily, Duke, and Stanford. So the way I like to say is I'm triply conflicted because I'm 50% a Duke official, and I'll have an adjunct appointment at Stanford if I make it through the cut at Stanford, which is haven't quite gotten that appointment yet, and I'm a Verily employee. I prefer to say we're working on solving the inconsistencies and the issues, but the basic idea is, I think I just heard it in the last discussion. We were standing outside, so I couldn't listen intently. But, you know, the dream is integrating all this information in a way that makes it analyzable to come up with algorithms that enable people to do what's best for them as individuals, but also for neighborhoods to do what's best for the neighborhood. The best information in the world to an individual is living in a social environment which is not conducive to healthful behavior, may not be very useful.
You know, again, Aspen Ideas Festival, they had one of the sponsors that year was Merck, and they had this program called Merck for Mothers, and the executive director of that was making the same point you were making, is that life expectancy was declining, and that you know, if you basically took a black woman in a hospital with no chronic conditions, her life expectancy was still less in some cases than someone else with multiple chronic conditions, and so that there were these other factors. So what is your research beginning to show in terms of some of the determinants of why there are these large disparities, particularly when race and economic status are involved? What are the biggest things you suspect is driving that?
Well, I wouldn't take any credit for the findings so far. I mean, it's going to be an intense effort, both at Verily and at Duke, where there's a new data science center. People used to scorn medical information because it was so messy, like the math department. They're now fascinated, and it's gotten good enough that I think a lot more analyses are going to be done looking at these factors. But Chris Murray's group, I think, has led the way. Many others have looked at it. Public health schools have taught for a century that social determinants of health far outweigh the biological determinants. And there's just no doubt that that's the case, except for, you know, really serious genetic diseases where the biology dictates. So it's the culture, it's the economics, it's the education that are really the critical proximal determinants of health.
You want to ask you, because you were, you know, the nation's leading official in the Food and Drug Administration. We were just talking a moment ago about what an unsafe avocation that is, because nobody likes the FDA, right? Does anybody like the FDA here? Maybe I would, but I'm interested in the question. I mean, you are a regulator, and you're out there to sort of secure and protect the public and the public good. But you were just telling me you would get regular death threats, you know, and that this was a challenge. And sort of, I'm interested less in the death threat issue than I am the tension between innovation that's driving a lot of this, and then the role of regulators and how to get that equilibrium right, and how do you communicate that broadly so that people like FDA commissioners more?
Well, I was actually, so first of all, let me just say, I think death threats are a way of life for public officials in the United States. And I think if you talk to most public officials, it's just part of the job, and you accept that if you go into this type of work. But you know, if you look at, and let me just say, I was excited by the discussion this morning because I heard most people saying it sounded like they thought the FDA was pretty much close to the right place. Maybe that was just because people don't want to get the FDA mad at them. I don't know. But I would say there's always this balance. And in fact, if you look at the FDA, the way I like to say it is it's a public health, science-based agency that has a regulatory function. And right in the mandate for the FDA, safety is number one, but innovation is the second structural basic goal of the FDA that's right there on the website as a goal. And so this is why, as you look at each situation, the balance of requirements for pre-market definitive evidence versus access changes. If you have a rare disease with no treatment, that's 100% lethal, you're going to be willing and should take a lot of risk on a new treatment. In my area, especially cardiovascular disease, if it's atherosclerosis, we got 20 effective treatments. Most of them are generic now. They're just not being used the way they should. And it's appropriate that you should have to prove the safety and effectiveness of your treatment before exposing millions of people to this treatment. So I think by and large, it's been interesting to watch the politics here. I was worried that Scott Gottlieb would be subjective to tweets from the president to do this and that. But you'll notice that the industry actually came and defended, I wouldn't say the status quo, but they defended the basic principle that in medical products you should prove safety and efficacy before exposing people to the risk, because the history is well known. When most products either don't work or have risks that exceed the benefits, over 90% of drugs, as I say, that get into phase 1, it's just so unpredictable that you've got to have a system that empirically demonstrates outcomes. And the industry really came to the defense of that basic principle as the politics played out.
One of the things I've liked about today's forum is we've had people from all different sectors. You've had investors and practitioners and folks in small industry, big industry, and different stakeholders, researchers and clinicians. And so I like looking at an ecosystem and asking, okay, what can be tweaked to get all of the stakeholders? One of the things I'm worried about today is the state of science, the state of investment, partnerships with universities, respect for research. Do you worry at all at that? Having been a steward of the system, we don't often, maybe it's not polite to talk about here in kind of research land in the West Coast where there's so much innovation going on. But I have to tell you, living in the East Coast, you get this sense that terrain is eroding somewhat, the respect for science and research. Do you have any sense of that?
Oh, I think the core, I would say the core issue in America beyond science is respect for truth, expertise, and people's ability to have faith and confidence in our established systems. And then when you get to science, there's just no question that it's a big issue. There's just an article in JAMA Internal Medicine this week on a TV series where a teenager commits suicide, and it's led to a huge increase in Google searches on suicide. And the question of how do you steer people to helpful information to prevent suicide instead of how-to documentaries, which are pervasive on the internet. That's just one example that we all need to be thinking about a lot. And one reason I chose to stay in North Carolina half-time, despite the allure of San Francisco, my old internship spot, is that universities, I think, need to take a step up, just like, the whiz-bang tech areas need to be more outreaching to the rest of America. Universities have been oblivious to the erosion of confidence, and they need to really take this on, I believe.
Before I go to the audience and get their questions and comments, I'm interested in the next wave that we see coming is big computational models, application of data, which you're already working on Verily, artificial intelligence, and you just sort of sense or feel that this whole new world is coming. And I'm interested in as you look at that crystal ball, what do you think the impacts, again, on health outcomes could be, given the big technological leaps that seem to be close?
Well, I think the reason for excitement is obvious. I mean, the potential is almost unfathomable. It's so great. And I do believe that when the magic button is pushed, the reason that I was so attracted to Verily and the Google family is what I heard somebody else this morning say. If anyone can integrate all this information, this is a group of people who can do it. I hope in a way much like digitizing libraries. You remember when you used to historians had to go to libraries and find the books. That whole field has been revolutionized by the fact they can search on words now from digitized libraries. And health could be the same way. But my point in general, I think the biggest, hardest issue is it's not going to be the computation. It's going to be the human translation. Technology changes, people tend to stay the same. And we got to figure out how to translate this tremendous knowledge into approaches where people can benefit where they live. one other thing just to mention that came up the other day that I'm fascinated by. I have been very worried about displacing jobs, and there's no question that's a big part of what's.
So you're a flat Earth person.
Well, it's what eats at
There
the
was no
rest of
laugh out
America. It eats up the rest of America to think they're these people that are busily creating automation to get rid of their jobs. The chief economist at Google has done a bunch of analyses, and others have too, that show maybe it's not such a worry because if you combine the drop in the birth rate, the aging of the population, the fact that women in the workplace have plateaued at a pretty high level, probably where it's going to stabilize. And I won't make too many comments about immigration. I think there's some mistakes being made there in America right now. But if that continues to be held back, we're going to have a big shortage of workers in the United States looking forward. So if we can take all this knowledge, use automation to get rid of redundant tasks where it can be done better by machine. And in healthcare, for example, imagine if all those insurance clerks, many of whom are really smart, were working in nursing homes or assisted living or healthy, aging people living at home. They could actually do fun, useful human things that would be much more meaningful than having this ridiculous, amazingly expensive processing of insurance claims that goes on. Surely a machine could do a better job of that.
Last quick question. Another one of the Google family or Alphabet family companies is Calico, which, as I understand, its mission is to end death. Are they a friend of yours or a competitor?
Both, I would say. And I'm actually having a session with Hal Barron, who's a very old dear friend, who has had an illustrious career at Genentech and Roche, and now Chief Medical Officer at Calico. And I'm going to learn a lot more about it, but we are meant to compete. I've learned that's part of the culture in the Google family, but we also share a lot of services, technology, and know-how. So I think the real advantage in the family is if you can reach out to the other parts of Google and bring in the best for whatever your mission is, it's unlimited potential. But again, we can't be haughty, elite intellectuals sitting in Silicon Valley and Boston and expect the rest of America is going to be pleased that we're so wealthy and feeling so good about ourselves.
Important message. Thank you. Let me open the floor to questions, comments. Yes, right here. Oop, and we'll go right here.
If you'll introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm John Langmead. I work for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and I'm just curious, where are the incentives going to come from to deal with the social determinants of health? Is that just the government's responsibility, or is it just private industries, or is there a mix, or what's your
Great question.
take on that?
And then,
I mean, you can probably tell from what I'm saying, I'm on the bandwagon about this. And, the same technology that people are excited about with biology also gives us an avenue in the social determinants of health. And what I found before I went to FDA, we had a CMMI project involving West Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, and Mississippi. And what you found is that everybody has a cell phone, everybody has an electronic health record now, and integrating the information with their participation, not talking about them, but actually involving them in it, I think is the avenue to deal with the social determinants of health. How do you make neighborhoods healthier places with people's involvement? The incentive, I think the wealthy Silicon Valley companies have got to contribute their part. I also think the government, and I'll make one political statement. You can't say anything, I know, and you shouldn't, but the policies should be aimed at reducing disparities, not increasing them. And I'm worried that some of the current policies may be doing that.
that's a little bit of an understatement, but that's okay. Yes, go right.
Hello, Barbara Biorian at the NASA Ames Research Center. A lot of our discussion about using the data presumes that the data is there and it's correct. But we know that the electronic health records are full of incomplete or inaccurate information. Is anybody addressing these issues in terms of making sure that the data really are valid?
Great question.
Sure, and it's a worry everyone has. So I'll just make 2 or 3 points that people could easily disagree with. I mean, the big hurdle was getting electronic health records for everybody in the U.S., and that's happened thanks to $60 billion of your tax money or whatever. And it is full of inconsistencies, but it's not going to get worse. It's only going to get better. And the reason is that almost every provider now is an employee or a long-term contractor with an integrated health system, integrated, taking different definitions. To function, they have to create increasingly sophisticated data warehouses that are very dependent on the quality of the data getting better so that they can make good decisions about allocation of resources. In addition to that, through projects that I've had the privilege of being involved with at FDA, like Sentinel, and now the Nest for devices, everyone would want to be part of the Nest, right? It's a good name, but the idea is constantly curating claims data and electronic health data into a common data model. And now PCORI has funded the PCORNet network, which has 120 million Americans' electronic health record data in it, updated every quarter to a common data model. So very high quality for a limited part of the total data set. So I just think we're in an iterative phase now where the data is going to get better and better. And what we need to do is to develop social systems that allow more sharing so that the pace of this increases. And we could talk a long time about how to do that, but I think it's underway.
I don't want to belabor this, but I chaired a forum at Spotlight Health on this issue, and one of the things you would hear from the medical providers and others that are out there is that the sunk costs in the private providers of healthcare systems are so enormous, it's actually hard for them to actually create an innovative. So I agree theoretically that what you just shared is where you'd like to go, but if you're talking to Mount Sinai or large health firms, they already have providers with all sorts of problems built into it. But I know that Aspen, the Health and Society program, is thinking about making a major effort in trying to raise that as an issue. So I just wanted to let you know that resource. One last question. Any other questions, comments? I'll just pick on you. Okay. Well, with that, let me.
We have one question
over here. Yes, I'm sorry.
Or comment.
I thought you winked at me or in the front row. So.
James from Helix.
Yeah.
So much of the data is actually being captured passively through electronic health records, through lab systems, and everyone has frankly, an economic incentive to keep that, partial to yourself and not share it. So I was curious if the model is we're going to integrate all the data into one place and we're going to be able to mine it in interesting ways. How do you build incentives actually for everyone to share?
Can you say the last part one more?
How do you build incentives for academic institutions to say we're going to submit and share that data, for laboratory companies to say we're going to submit that data as well, where everyone can share the economics?
Yeah, so let me just say, I don't think the American model will ever be all the data in one place. And so there are models of federating information that are well developed. Sentinel actually, FDA has access to 200 million Americans' data, and it's done by keeping it with the data providers, curating the data to a common data model, and then asking questions which get answered so people don't surrender their data. But I will say, right now the number one hoarder of data is the big integrated academic health systems, and we do have to overcome that. And I think it's going to happen because activated patient groups are going to be the key people who make this happen. There's nothing more effective than a mad as hell group of parents with kids whose kids are not being helped because some academic center is hoarding the information. And Joe Biden would be my number one prototype now. What happened with his son was, he had a brain biopsy at one place, and when he went around to cancer centers, he would ask the question, do you have access to my son's brain biopsy? And they would say, no, that's not the way we do it. So if you look at the cancer moonshot and what's behind it, half of it is more funding for research, but the other half is really pushing not just incentives, but for sharing data, but maybe punishments for not doing it when it's appropriate. I think it's one of the most important things that we can do now.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rob Califf.
Thank you so much, Dr. Califf. Thank you, Steve. That is a wrap. Thanks to all our speakers, our moderators this morning. I'd like to especially thank our underwriter, Pharma, for making this Atlantic Forum possible. I think it's fair to say that this was a rich and wide-ranging conversation, and clearly there's no shortage of brilliant minds or entrepreneurial spirit fueling the innovation pipeline. And we also just got a somber reminder from Dr. Califf about our two Americas and the lack of access for so many. I was struck early in the morning by Carol Gallagher, one of the venture capitalists we heard from, who so eloquently said, if you marry unmet medical needs and solving problems for patients, the economics will work out. She also reminded us that you can't cut corners and that biology is immensely complex. And so this is clearly a long game and a subject worthy of much further exploration. Thank you for spending a long morning with us. You've been a magnificent audience. I'm impressed by your level of engagement and that you stayed here with us. I know how busy you all are, and I must say that the time that you give us is actually the most generous and important thing we could possibly ask for. I'm going to ask for one more thing. You will get an email from me in short order asking for your feedback this morning. It's actually, what we hear from you is enormously important to us as we plan these forums and summits, so we'd be grateful for a minute or two of your time to just tell us what you thought. With that, thank you so much. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.